A 32-year-old widow stepped off a stagecoach in a Montana frontier town, and the entire crowd burst out laughing. They laughed at her size, her worn dress, her quiet eyes that didn't flinch. They said she'd be gone before the first snow. They said Rhett Calloway had made the biggest mistake of his life. But 60 seconds after her boots touched that frozen dirt, a 1,000-pound black horse came screaming through the center of town, and every single one of those laughing people ran. Every one of them. Except her. If you want to know what happened next, like this video, drop a comment with the city you're watching from and follow along. Let's see how far this story travels. The stagecoach from Billings was 4 hours late, which gave the people of Frost Creek plenty of time to gather, speculate, and work themselves into a fine mood for judgment. They stood along the main street in clusters, outside the general store, leaning against the post office railing. A few women clustered near the millinery with their arms folded and their heads tilted just slightly, the way people tilt their heads when they've already decided what they think and are only waiting for confirmation. The children were worse. Children always are. They perched on fence posts and barrel tops, loud and unguarded in the way that adults learn to hide behind politeness. Frost Creek, Montana, in the autumn of 1883, was not a cruel town exactly. It was a hard one. There's a difference, though the line blurs easy enough when winters run 6 months long and the ground fights you every season and the nearest real city is a 2-day ride in good weather. People in hard towns develop a particular kind of humor, dry and sharp, and pointed at whatever is weakest, because laughing at weakness is the quickest way to assure yourself you don't share it. The subject of their waiting was a woman named Brinley Hartwell, 32 years old, widowed out of Columbus, Ohio, 18 months prior. She had answered an advertisement placed in the Ohio Farmers Gazette by a rancher named Rhett Calloway of Frost Creek, Montana Territory, who was seeking a capable woman of good character to serve as wife and partner on a working cattle ranch. The advertisement had been direct and largely unsentimental, which Brinley had appreciated. It said nothing about beauty or youth or a pleasant disposition toward hardship. It said capable and good character, and Brinley Hartwell figured she had both of those, even if she couldn't lay much claim to anything else. She was a large woman, not heavy in the soft way, son, heavy in the way of a woman who had worked all her life and whose body had responded accordingly. Wide through the shoulders, strong hands, a face that was plain but not unkind, with gray blue eyes that had the quality of looking at things straight on without much decorating of what they saw. Her traveling dress was brown wool, practical, with no frills or flouncing. Her hat was simple. She carried one trunk and a canvas bag that held her tools, a good bone-handled knife, a leather roll of sewing needles, a small medical kit she had assembled herself from a handbook she'd studied during the long train journey west. She was not what Frost Creek had been expecting. What they had been expecting, most of them, was something smaller and softer and more decorative. Rhett Calloway was not the richest man in the territory, but he was known, respected, and his ranch, the Box C, about 6 miles east of town, was one of the more solid operations in the county. People had opinions about what sort of woman ought to arrive to marry into that. Brinley Hartwell, stepping down from the stagecoach into the gray October afternoon with her trunk and her canvas bag and her direct gray-blue eyes, did not match those opinions. The laughter started low. A muffled sound from somewhere near the feed store. Then someone's teenage son said something that Brinley couldn't make out, but that produced a sharp burst of amusement from the group around him. A woman near the millinery leaned toward her companion and whispered, and the companion pressed her lips together in that particular way that means, I'm trying not to laugh, and failing. Brinley stood on the step of the stagecoach and took one slow look down the length of Frost Creek's main street. She had been stared at her entire life. She knew exactly what this was. She felt it settle in her chest the way cold settles in, not painful immediately, just present, seeping in through every gap. She stepped down onto the dirt. The driver handed her trunk down. She thanked him by name. She had made a point of learning it during the ride. And he looked faintly surprised, the way people do when they expect to be invisible and find that they aren't. You're the Calloway woman. A man had separated himself from the group near the post office. Short, broad-featured, with a deputy's badge pinned slightly crooked on his coat. He said it the way you say something when you already know the answer and are really just saying, I'm looking at you and finding you wanting. Brinley Hartwell, she said. Rhett Calloway was supposed to meet me here. Is he? He's coming. The deputy looked her over with no particular attempt at subtlety. Sent word he'd be late. Something with the north fence line. A pause. You're bigger than I expected. There was open laughter at that. Not quiet anymore. Brinley looked at the deputy for a moment. So is Montana, she said, and picked up her canvas bag and walked to the edge of the boardwalk to wait. A few people laughed at that too, but it was a different kind of laugh, shorter and less comfortable, and the deputy looked away. She waited 15 minutes before anyone spoke to her again. The crowd didn't disperse. They had come for entertainment, and they were going to get it. But they kept their distance, like she was an exhibit at a fair. A heavy-set woman came out of the general store, looked at Brinley, went back inside. A pair of young ranch hands rode past slowly, and one of them said something to the other that made them both grin. A little girl with red braids sat on a fence post across the street and stared at Brinley with the uncomplicated directness of a child who hasn't yet learned that staring is rude. Brinley looked back at her. After a moment, the girl held up her rag doll, apparently for inspection. Brinley nodded once, as if the doll met her approval. The girl seemed satisfied and went back to whatever she was thinking about. That was when they heard it. The sound came from behind the feed store at the north end of the street. A crack of wood, a crash that rattled windows, and then a sound that was unmistakably a horse screaming. Not whinnying, screaming. The sound a horse makes when it's beyond fear and into something worse. People turned. What came around the corner of the feed store was the biggest horse Brinley Hartwell had ever seen in her life. Black, not dark bay, not seal brown, but true black, the color of cast iron with no white markings anywhere on him. He stood somewhere over 17 hands, with a chest like a barrel, and legs that hit the ground with the weight of something that knew it could break whatever it struck. He came around the corner sideways, half rearing, and the broken rail he'd dragged through the fence was still tangled around his back left leg, which was why he was screaming. Every time he tried to run, the rail caught and wrenched, and the pain sent him sideways again. Nightfall. Even Brinley had heard the name on the road, and the stagecoach driver had mentioned it, half joking, half genuine warning. The Callaway Ranch's black horse that had thrown 3 men and put one in the county doctor's bed for 6 weeks. The horse that Rhett Callaway kept because he was too proud to sell a problem and too stubborn to have him shot, and that the rest of Frost Creek agreed was only a matter of time before someone died. He came through the center of the street at a dead run, dragging the rail, and the crowd scattered like birds off a wire. Women grabbed children. Men jumped for the boardwalks. The deputy shouted something no one paid attention to. Horses tied at the hitching post screamed and reared against their leads, and somewhere behind the livery a dog was barking itself into a frenzy. Brinley did not move. She was standing at the edge of the boardwalk, and she stood there and watched the horse come, and she processed what she was seeing with the part of her mind that had always been slower to panic than the rest of her, the part that her late husband Thomas had called that aggravating steadiness of yours. Never affectionately, but it had kept her alive through 3 hard Ohio winters and 1 very bad spring flood, and she trusted it more than she trusted most things. The horse was not charging. He was running blind from pain and terror, which was different. His eyes were white-rimmed, and he was throwing his head in a way that had nothing to do with aggression and everything to do with desperation. He didn't know where he was going. He couldn't, with that rail catching and jerking at him with every stride. Then she saw the little girl. The child with the red braids had been knocked off her fence post in the chaos, or maybe she jumped, and she was sitting in the dirt in the middle of the street, 10 feet in front of where the horse was heading, and she was frozen absolutely still the way small children go still when fear overrides everything else. She wasn't crying, she wasn't moving, she was just sitting there holding her rag doll, and the horse was coming at her at full speed, and there was no one between them. Brinley dropped her canvas bag. She didn't run. Running would have startled him worse. She walked, fast but measured, the way you approach anything that's already frightened. And she put herself between the horse and the child, and she planted her feet, and she did not look away. Later, people would ask her what she was thinking in that moment. She would say she wasn't particularly. She would say she saw a child in the street and she went and stood in front of her, and that was all there was to it. People found this unsatisfying. They wanted something more heroic. A speech she'd made to herself, a calculation of odds, a moment of righteous determination. The truth was simpler and stranger than that. She was afraid. She was very, very afraid. Her hands were shaking and her knees were soft, and she could feel her heartbeat all the way up into her throat. But she stood there anyway, because the child was behind her and the horse was in front of her. And that was the situation, and it didn't seem to her like there was much to decide. She raised one hand, open palm out, not at the horse, not really, just up, the way you do when you're trying to tell the world to slow down for 1 second. "Hey," she said, not loud, not commanding, just, "Hey." The horse was 40 feet away, 30, 20. Then something happened that no one watching could fully account for afterward. He slowed, not gradually. There was no gradual about it. He went from a full panicked run to a lurching, stiff-legged stop in the space of about 3 strides, close enough that Brinley could feel the heat of him and smell the sweat and iron fear smell that horses carry when they're in extremis. His hooves threw dirt, and the rail swung around and cracked into the ground 8 feet to Brinley's left. And he stood there, chest heaving, eyes still white-rimmed and wild, and looked at her. She looked back at him. "You're all right," she said, which was a lie. But it was the kind of lie you tell someone when you need them to believe it so badly that the believing itself is the only thing that matters. "You're all right. Nothing's going to hurt you." The horse breathed. His sides heaved like bellows. His nostrils flared, and he threw his head once, twice, testing whether the fear was still there, and then very slowly the whites of his eyes began to recede. Behind Brinley, she heard the little girl start to cry. The delayed gulping sobs of a child who has been too frightened to cry and is only now catching up. Brinley didn't turn around. She kept her eyes on the horse. "Someone get the child," she said, quietly but clearly. Footsteps. The sobbing receded. She heard a woman's voice, the child's mother, she guessed, from the quality of the terror in it. Brinley took one careful step toward the horse. He flinched back. She stopped. Waited. Let him look at her and find that she was still just standing there, still not running, still not doing anything that merited the full force of his fear. She took another step. This time he didn't move. She reached out slowly, slowly enough that she could have counted to 10, between the moment her hand left her side and the moment it reached the space just in front of his nose, not touching him, just offering the proximity, the smell of her, something different from the iron and fear and the shouting and the pain. He dropped his nose to her hand, not a gentle nudge. He shoved his nose into her palm with the force of something desperate for contact, and she felt his breath in quick hot bursts against her skin, and she kept her hand there and didn't pull away. "There," she said. "There you go." The street behind her was completely silent. She became aware of it the way you become aware of a sound stopping, the absence of it more striking than the presence had been. The shouting had stopped. The horses at the hitching posts had settled. Even the dog behind the livery had given it up. Frost Creek's main street stood in a silence that had no equivalent in Brinley's recent experience, and she was standing in the middle of it with a 17-hand black horse pressing his nose into her palm. She stood there for a while. She didn't know how long. Long enough for his breathing to slow towards something like regular. Long enough for the rail tangled around his back leg to stop moving, because he had stopped trying to run from it. "Got a knife?" she said, to no one in particular. A pause. Then the deputy's voice, different now from what it had been, quieter, stripped of something. "Here." She heard him take a few steps toward her and stop. She turned just enough to take the knife from his outstretched hand without losing her contact with the horse. She crouched slowly and cut the rail free. The horse flinched hard when she touched the rope near his leg, but he didn't kick and he didn't bolt. And when the wood fell away, he shifted his weight and blew out a long, shuddering breath. Brinley straightened up and looked at the wound on his leg. Rope burn mostly, angry and raw but not deep, nothing that wouldn't heal. She pressed her hand flat against his neck and felt the trembling there, deep in the muscle, the aftershock of terror slowly working itself out. "Someone's going to need to walk him somewhere quiet," she said. "Somewhere dark, no noise. And someone's going to need to clean this leg properly." No one answered for a moment. "We could shoot him," someone offered. A man's voice from somewhere to her left. Not cruel exactly, just practical in the flat way that frontier practicality can be. "You could?" Brinley said. "He'd probably prefer this." Another silence. "That's Calloway's horse," someone else said. "I know who he belongs to." Brinley kept her hand on the horse's neck. Where's a safe enclosure? Chup. They put Nightfall in a paddock behind the livery while they waited for Rhett Calloway. Someone brought water. Someone else brought a bucket of feed and left it at the gate without coming any closer. The livery owner's boy, about 14, leaned on the fence and watched Brinley stand with the horse with an expression of pure, unguarded amazement. "He threw Mr. Dawson through a fence in August," the boy said. "I heard." Brinley was checking the rope burn on Nightfall's leg with careful fingers. The horse stood for it, which surprised her. His muscles were tight as wire the whole time, but he stood. "You got any calendula salve in that livery?" "I don't know what that is." "Arnica, then. Something for a burn." The boy disappeared. The horse turned his head and looked at Brinley with one dark eye. She looked back at him. "I know," she said. "I know it hurts." She was doing that, standing quiet with the horse's head dropped to her shoulder, when Rhett Calloway arrived. She heard him before she saw him. The sound of a horse ridden hard, then pulled up, then boots on the ground moving fast. Then his voice. "Where is he? Is he—" And then he came around the corner of the livery and stopped. He was about what she'd expected from his letters. 40 or close to it. Built for the work, not large but hard-looking, the way men get when they've done physical work every day for 20 years. Dark hair going gray at the temples. A face that had probably been handsome when it was younger and had settled into something more interesting, something with more angles to it, weathered in particular. He had a cut on his jaw that looked recent, probably from whatever had happened with the north fence. He was looking at Nightfall, then at her, then at his horse. "He's not hurt bad," she said. "Rope burn on the back left leg. He needs it cleaned and wrapped, and then he needs to be left alone somewhere quiet for a couple days." Rhett Calloway stared at her for a long moment. "He threw 3 men," he said. "I know. He put Hector Dawson in bed for 6 weeks, I heard." She stepped away from the horse slowly, giving him time to register her movement. "He didn't throw me." Rhett Calloway looked at his horse, then back at her. He had the look of a man trying to reorganize his understanding of something. You could see it happening across his face, that slow, reluctant rearranging. "You're Brinley Hartwell," he said. "I am." "You're smaller than I expected." He said it differently than the deputy had, not as a judgment, just as a fact he was noting, and then even that seemed to catch him, and something shifted in his expression. "I didn't mean—" "It's fine." She'd heard it said worse. "You want to sort out the horse first or the introduction?" He blinked. Then something that was almost a laugh moved across his face and disappeared. "Introduction, I suppose, since we're—" He cleared his throat. "Since you came all this way." "All right." She held out her hand. Not the fingers forward gesture of a woman offering her hand to be shaken lightly. Her whole hand, the way you'd offer it to a partner or an equal. "Brinley Hartwell. I can cook, I can sew, I can doctor minor injuries in men and livestock both. I kept a farm in Ohio running for 3 years with no help, and I am not afraid of that horse." He looked at her hand. Then he shook it. Firmly, because she had offered it firmly, and he was not a man who met things at half measure. "Rhett Calloway," he said. "Box C Ranch, about 6 miles east. I've got a cook already, and the doctoring will likely come in useful, and—" He glanced at Nightfall again. "That part I can see." They stood there in the paddock with the horse between them, and the October light going copper-gray on the livery walls, and neither of them saying anything for a moment. "The town laughed at me," she said. "Not a complaint, just noting it." "The town laughs at most things," he said. He didn't try to deny it or explain it away, which she appreciated. "Will you?" He looked at her directly. He had brown eyes, she noticed. Not warm exactly, or not yet. Clear, though. Honest in the way that can't be performed. "No," he said. That was enough for now. She had not expected more than that. The ride out to the Box C was quiet. Rhett drove the wagon, and Brinley sat beside him, and Nightfall was left in the livery paddock with instructions from Rhett to the livery owner, spoken in a tone that left no room for interpretation, that the horse was not to be disturbed, poked at, or handled by anyone. The road wound east out of Frost Creek through hills that were losing their color to autumn. The the scrub grass gone pale gold, the cottonwoods mostly stripped. The sky was enormous and low and the color of pewter. Brinley had grown up with Ohio skies, and even after weeks of train and stagecoach travel westward, the Montana sky startled her. It was not just bigger, it was heavier. It pressed down with a kind of authority that Ohio skies, comfortable and bounded, never had. "How long have you had him?" she asked. Nightfall, she meant. Rhett didn't have to ask who she meant. 3 years. Bought him off a horse trader who didn't know what he had, or claimed not to. He was already what he is when I got him. What he is, she repeated. Dangerous. He said it without editorializing. Frightened, she said. A pause. That's one word for it. It's the right word. She wasn't arguing, just stating. A horse that's dangerous because he wants to be dangerous acts differently than a horse that's dangerous because he's scared. He stopped. When I held up my hand, he stopped. An animal that wants to hurt things doesn't stop. Rhett was quiet for a moment. You've worked with horses before. Some. My husband had a team. One of them was difficult. She paused. Thomas, my husband, wanted to sell him. I kept him. And? Worked out. She looked at the hills. Eventually. Rhett seemed to consider this. What happened to Thomas? Fever. January of '82. She said it flat and factual the way she said most things. It was fast. I was glad it was fast. He didn't offer condolences. She had noticed that some people did and some people didn't, and she had come to prefer the ones who didn't. The ones who understood that saying I'm sorry for your loss to someone who has had 18 months to make their peace with a loss is less for the grieving person than for the person doing the comforting. He just nodded once and let it lie. My wife died 4 years ago, he said after a while. Charlotte. Fever, same as Thomas. We had a daughter. She's in Billings now with Charlotte's sister. A pause. Her name is Ada. She's 9. Brinley took that in. The letters had mentioned Charlotte, the first wife, deceased, but not Ada. She wasn't sure if the omission was intentional or an oversight, and she decided it didn't much matter. Does Ada know you were bringing someone out? She knows. He stared at the road. Whether she's settled to it is a different question. That's honest, she thought. It would have been easy to say yes, she's fine, don't worry about it. He hadn't. I won't push it, she said. If she comes to visit, or when. She corrected herself. I won't push it. He glanced at her sideways, not evaluating, something else. You've thought about this. I've had 3 weeks on a train to think. She folded her hands in her lap. I've been a wife before. I wasn't particularly good at the soft parts of it, the domestic, decorative parts. I'm better at the practical. I don't want to come out to your ranch and play at something I'm not. What are you then? She thought about it. The wagon rolled and the hills shifted past, and the pewter sky pressed down overhead. Steady, she said, finally. I'm steady. I get things done. I don't rattle easy usually. I'm not what people expect, and I've stopped spending much energy trying to be. Rhett Calloway nodded slowly. Whether that satisfied him, she couldn't tell. He was not a man who broadcast his interior life. That much was clear already. The box C came into view around a long bend. The ranch house first, low and solid, log construction with a covered porch that ran the length of the front, then the barn and the bunkhouse, and 3 separate outbuildings, and beyond that the corrals and the beginning of the pasture ground, pale and vast in the October afternoon. It was not beautiful, exactly. It was functional in the way that things built to survive are functional. Nothing extra, nothing wasted, everything placed where it was because that was where it needed to be. But there was something about the proportions of it that was, she searched for the word, right. Things sat the way they should sit on the land, like the ranch and the land had worked something out between them. It's a good setup, she said. She felt him look at her. Most people say something about how wild it is, or how far from town. Most people are comparing it to other things, she said. I'm looking at what's here. He pulled the wagon up in front of the ranch house and climbed down. When he offered her a hand down, she took it because the step was high and her trunk was behind her and it was practical, not because she needed the gesture. He seemed to understand the difference. 2 men came out of the bunkhouse as they unloaded. Young, both of them, early 20s, with the careful blankness that ranch hands put on when they're not sure what to think of a new situation. Rhett introduced them. Cal was the taller one, with a gap between his front teeth and an easy way of standing that suggested he hadn't met many problems he couldn't wait out. Denny was shorter, compact, with quick dark eyes that took in Brinley and registered something. Surprise, maybe, or recalibration, and then went neutral again. "Ma'am," said Cal. "Ma'am," said Denny. "Brinley's fine," she said. Neither of them looked entirely sure about that. They brought her trunk inside. The ranch house was spare, furniture built for use, a table that had been repaired twice in the same place, curtains that were functional, and nothing more. The kitchen was better organized than she'd expected, which told her something about Rhett, or about whoever had kept things before her. There was a second bedroom off the hall, small and plainly furnished, and Rhett showed it to her without a great deal of ceremony. "This is yours," he said. "We can—" He stopped, started again. "We can sort out the arrangements in whatever way suits you. I'm not expecting—" "Give it time," she said. "That's fine." He looked relieved, which she found humanizing. She had been a little worried he might be the kind of man who found discussing such things an insult to his dignity. He was not that kind of man, apparently. She unpacked her trunk while he went to check on the evening feeding, and she put her things where they made sense and hung her 2 spare dresses on the hooks behind the door and set her medical kit on the shelf above the washstand. When she was done, she stood in the middle of the small room and listened to the particular silence of a Montana ranch in the late afternoon, the far sound of cattle, the closer sound of the barn, the wind against the north wall, and she took stock of herself. She was tired. She was uncertain. The town's laughter was still sitting in her chest where the cold had settled, and there was a part of her that wondered, not for the first time and probably not for the last, whether this had been the right thing to do, whether the courage it had taken to send that letter and board that train and stand in the middle of a strange Montana street while a black horse bore down on her was going to be enough to get her through what came next. She decided she wasn't going to answer that question tonight. Gideon Pike showed up for supper. He came in through the back door of the kitchen without knocking. The practiced entry of a man who has always treated this space as an extension of his own territory, and stopped when he saw Brinley standing at the stove. He was somewhere north of 50, with a face that carried its years heavily, deep lines around the eyes and mouth, a jaw that had gone to jowl, a body that had been powerful once and was still substantial, though it had redistributed itself in the way of a man who supervises more than he labors. He wore his foreman authority visibly, in the set of his shoulders, and the particular flatness of his expression that said, "I have been here longer than you, and I intend to still be here when you're gone." He looked at Brinley for a long, unhurried moment. "You're the one from Ohio," he said. "That's right. Heard what happened in town." He moved to the table and pulled out a chair and sat down without being invited. "With the horse." "Did you?" "Lucky." He said it with the absolute conviction of a man who has already decided on his interpretation. Nothing but luck, that was. Horse was spooked and confused. Could have happened to anyone. Brinley turned back to the pot she was stirring. "I suppose it could have. I've handled nightfall before." "How'd that go?" A pause. Not a comfortable one. "That horse is a danger. I've told Rhett that." "What does Rhett say?" "Rhett has a blind spot for that animal." Another pause. "He won't listen to reason about it." Brinley ladled stew into bowls. She had found enough in the kitchen larder to make something serviceable. Not elegant, but solid. The kind of food that did what food was supposed to do. She set a bowl in front of Gideon's place before she had decided whether she meant to, working on the automatic hospitality of someone who has cooked for working men before. He looked at the bowl, then at her. "I've run this ranch for 8 years," he said. "Before Charlotte got sick and after. I know how things work here." "I imagine you do." She sat down across the table from him with her own bowl. "I'm not trying to change how things work." "No?" "I'm trying to learn how they work. It's different." He regarded her with that flat expression. "Most women want to change everything," he said. "Get out here, get one look at how we do things, and start in on how we should be doing them otherwise." "I've got no opinion on how you run the ranch," she said, which was not entirely true but was true enough for a first supper. "That's Rhett's business and yours." Gideon picked up his spoon. He turned it in his fingers. How long did you keep your farm in Ohio before you answered an advertisement in a gazette? 3 years. And you couldn't make it work. She looked at him. I made it work, she said. I chose to come here instead. That's different from failure. He smiled at that, a thin, controlled expression that didn't reach anywhere near his eyes. We'll see how long you last, he said, and started eating. Rhett came in 10 minutes later. He looked at Gideon and at Brinley, and at the 2 bowls on the table, and something moved briefly through his expression. Not anger, but a kind of attention, the look of a man who is noting something for later consideration. Gideon, he said. Rhett. Gideon didn't look up from his bowl. Rhett washed his hands at the basin and sat down, and Brinley put a bowl in front of him, and for a while they ate in the silence of people who are all in the same room, but occupying entirely separate conversations. Outside the kitchen window, the Montana dark came down hard and complete the way it does out on the range, where there's nothing between you and the stars but the cold. Stew's good, Rhett said. Thank you. Charlotte used to put dried chili in it, Gideon said. Gave it more character. No one answered that. After supper, Gideon went back to the bunkhouse and Brinley cleared the dishes, and Rhett stayed at the table with his coffee, not talking, and Brinley did not find the silence uncomfortable, which surprised her a little. He'll test you, Rhett said, when she was drying the last bowl. I know. He does it to everyone. A pause. He's a good foreman. The ranch wouldn't have survived the bad years without him. I understand. I'm not making excuses for him. I know that too. She hung the cloth on its hook. I don't need you to run interference on his behalf or mine. I can sort out my own territory. Rhett looked up at her. That same quality she'd seen earlier, that recalibration, the slow reorganizing of an expectation. All right, he said. She said goodnight and went to her room and lay on the spare bed in the Montana dark and listened to the sounds of the ranch settling, the creak of the barn, the low sounds of cattle, a coyote somewhere a long way off. And she thought about a 17-hand black horse pressing his nose into her palm with the force of something desperate for contact. She thought about fear, the way it could look, from the outside like violence, the way people could spend their whole lives treating a frightened thing like a dangerous one and never stop to wonder if there was a difference. She thought about Frost Creek and the laughter and the deputy's face when he handed her his knife. She thought about the little girl with the red braids and the rag doll. She did not think about whether she had made the right decision. She was here now, in this small room, in this hard land, and the only direction available was forward, and she had always been better at forward than at backward, so that was fine. She closed her eyes and listened to the wind, and eventually she slept. She was up before dawn. That was her habit, and she saw no reason to change it for a new place. She built the kitchen fire and put coffee on, and stood at the kitchen window in the dark and watched the Boxee's yard materialize slowly as the first light came up. Gray, then the palest blue, then finally something closer to gold where the sun was going to break over the eastern hills. When Rhett came in at 5:30, he stopped in the doorway. You're up, he said. Coffee's ready. She pushed the cup toward him. He took it and stood at the window beside her, and they watched the light come in. He didn't ask why she was up so early, and she didn't explain herself, and the silence was the kind that settles into a kitchen on a cold morning and becomes part of the warmth of it. I want to go see Nightfall today, she said, when someone can bring him out from town. I'll send Cal in this morning. Tell him to walk the horse. Don't ride him. Rhett looked at her. You know he... Tell Cal to walk him, she said. He'll be sore and rattled, and the last thing he needs is weight on his back. Rhett was quiet a moment. Then, all right. She had not expected him to push back exactly, but she had expected more resistance than all right. It told her something about him, about what he'd been looking for when he'd placed that advertisement in the Ohio Farmer's Gazette, about what he might be willing to trust her with, given time. Outside, the first of the ranch hands were moving toward the barn. Gideon Pike came out of the bunkhouse and stopped in the yard and looked toward the house, and even from the kitchen window, Brinley could read the specific quality of his attention, assessing, calculating, finding angles. She watched him. She lifted her coffee cup and drank. All right, she thought. Let's see then. Cal brought Nightfall out from Frost Creek on a Wednesday morning, walking him the full 6 miles the way Brinley had asked, And when the horse came into the Box C's yard, he was nothing like the animal that had come screaming through the center of town 4 days prior. He was quiet, not calm. There's a difference, but quiet in the way of something that has used up all its noise and hasn't yet decided what comes next. He walked with his head low and his ears tuned to everything, and the rope burn on his back left leg had stiffened into something that made him favor it slightly on the downstroke. Cal led him in at an easy pace, and you could tell by the way Cal was holding the lead rope, slack, barely touching it, that he had taken the instructions seriously and the horse had led him. Brinley was waiting at the corral gate. She had spent the 4 days since her arrival making herself useful in the ways that were available to her, patching a section of the kitchen larder shelf that had started to pull from the wall, reorganizing the supply inventory so that things that needed to be found quickly were at the front, restitching 2 of Denny's work gloves that had split at the seams, without making any particular show of any of it. She had learned in Ohio that the fastest way to make yourself unwelcome in a new situation was to arrive announcing all the things you intended to improve. Better to just improve them and let people notice or not, as they chose. Gideon had noticed. She could tell by the way his eyes tracked her movements across the yard, by the slight delay before he answered her when she asked where things were kept. He had the look of a man doing arithmetic in his head, calculating whether she was a net positive or a net threat, and not yet satisfied with either answer. Rhett had noticed too, differently. He didn't comment and he didn't compliment and he didn't get in her way, which she was starting to understand was its own form of acknowledgement from him. But the horse was the thing she had been thinking about. Cal handed her the lead rope at the gate. He was fine, Cal said, with a note of something in his voice. Not quite surprised, but close. Didn't pull once the whole rode in. Good. She ran her hand down Nightfall's neck. He flinched at the first touch, a full-body shudder, but he didn't pull back. How's the leg? Walking on it, little stiff. All right. Thank you, Cal. Cal lingered. She could feel him wanting to say something and not being sure if he should. After a moment, he said it anyway. He's put 2 men in the dirt since Rhett bought him. Hector Dawson, you probably heard, and before that a breaker we brought in from over Billings way. The breaker said there wasn't a horse born he couldn't work. Spent 2 weeks on Nightfall and quit. A pause. Just so you know what you're working with. I appreciate it, she said. And she did. She led Nightfall into the corral and unclipped the lead rope and stepped back and let him go. He didn't run. He walked to the far end of the corral and stood with his head over the fence rail, looking out at the pasture, and his tail moved once and then was still. Brinley sat on the fence and watched him. That was all she did. She sat there for an hour that first morning, not approaching, not making demands, not doing anything except being a presence in his vicinity that didn't ask anything of him. He watched her watching him for about 20 minutes. Then he went back to looking at the pasture. She took that as a reasonable beginning. She came every morning before dawn, the same way she had started her days since arriving at the Box C. The pre-dawn hour had a particular quality out here that she hadn't found anywhere else, a specific kind of stillness that wasn't quiet exactly, because the ranch was never truly quiet, but was less loud than the rest of the day in a way that felt intentional, like the land was thinking. She would bring a coffee cup and lean on the corral fence and not go inside and not make gestures toward the horse. Just presence. Just the fact of her repeated, until it stopped being remarkable. Nightfall spent the first 3 mornings at the opposite fence. On the 4th morning, he had moved to the middle of the corral by the time she arrived. On the 5th morning, he was 15 feet from the fence she was leaning on. On the 6th morning, she spoke to him. Not commands, not coaxing. She talked to him the way you talk to yourself when you're working something through, low and meandering, without much structure. The trick with Ohio winters, she told him, is that they get you by degrees. It doesn't go from autumn to winter. It slides. You're not cold, and then you're cold but not badly cold, and then one morning you get up and the pump is frozen and you can't remember when it wasn't. She set her coffee cup on the fence post. Thomas never believed me about that. He said I exaggerated. He was from Virginia originally, and he thought anything that wasn't Virginia winters was manageable. She paused. He was wrong about that. He was wrong about several things. He was right about some of them too. The horse had turned to face her sometime during this. She didn't make a point of it, didn't reach toward him or take a step, just kept talking. I'm not sure what to do about Gideon Pike, she said. I know what he's doing. He's making himself large so I stay small. The thing is, if I push back too hard, I confirm what he already thinks, that I'm a problem, that I'm here to disrupt the order of things. If I don't push back at all, he'll conclude I'm manageable. She picked up her coffee. There's a narrow path between those two things, and I'm still finding it. The horse took one step toward her. She kept her eyes forward, drank her coffee. Let him come to her conclusion in his own time. He took another step. It's the same with you, isn't it? She said, not really asking. Everyone either tries to break you or they back away. Neither one tells you anything useful. She set the cup down again. There's something in between. I'm going to stand here every morning until you believe that. By the end of the second week, Nightfall was meeting her at the fence. Not every morning. He had bad mornings. Mornings where he stood at the far rail and his eyes were white-rimmed and something had happened in the night that had ratcheted his fear back up again. And on those mornings, Brinley did not push. She sat on the fence and drank her coffee and left when the breakfast bell rang, same as always. But on the good mornings, he came to the fence and she reached through the rails and laid her palm flat against his nose and he breathed into it. And that was something. She did not tell people this was happening. She didn't announce it or make a story of it. The hands saw what they saw from a distance, and what they said among themselves she wasn't privy to and didn't try to be. Gideon saw it too. She knew he did. She caught him watching from the corner of the bunkhouse one morning, and when she looked directly at him, he moved away without acknowledging the look. What he made of what he saw she couldn't have said, but something in his expression in those first weeks, a flatness that had been so consistent she'd almost stopped reading it as a signal, had begun to develop a crease in it. Something tight and compressed, like a thing being pressurized. She was in the kitchen mid-morning on a Saturday when she heard voices in the yard. Loud, not shouting, but the particular volume of men not bothering to moderate themselves because they've assumed the person they're discussing can't hear. Can't last, Gideon was saying. That horse will hurt her, and then Rhett's going to have to answer for it. She seems to know what she's doing. That was Cal, and she could hear the caution in his voice, the tone of a man navigating between two people with authority. She seems, Gideon said. There's a difference between seeming and doing. That horse has fooled people before, gets them thinking he's settled, and then a sound of dismissal, a flat exhalation. She's a woman from Ohio who kept a farm. She's not a horsebreaker. Nobody said she was. Nobody needs to say it. You watch what she's doing out there, sitting on a fence talking to an animal. That's not working a horse. That's wasting time and waiting to get hurt. Cal didn't answer that. Brinley kept her hands in the bread dough she was working and didn't go to the window. She noted Gideon's words, filed them, the way she filed most things, and kept working. That afternoon she went to Rhett. He was in the barn doing something with a bridle, and he looked up when she came in and waited, which she appreciated. He had a habit of waiting when she approached him, of actually stopping what he was doing instead of talking at his task. A small thing that she'd noticed because Thomas had never done it. I want to try to get a lead rope on Nightfall tomorrow, she said. Rhett set the bridle down. All right. I want to do it myself, no hands watching. Gideon's going to say something about that. I know. He's going to say you're putting yourself in danger and I'm letting it happen. He'll be right about the first part, possibly, not the second. She met his eyes. That horse isn't ready to be handled by anyone who's been using force on him. If I go in there with someone watching over the fence with a rifle, he's going to feel it. Animals know the difference. Rhett was quiet a moment. He had a way of being quiet that wasn't absence. It was more like he was taking the time to look at something from more than one angle before he committed to a direction. She'd come to rely on it as a signal that he was actually listening. You think he's making progress, he said. Nightfall. I think he is. Even with the bad mornings. She paused. How do you know about the bad mornings? He picked up the bridle again. The corner of his mouth moved, not quite a smile. I'm up before dawn too, he said. She thought about that. All those mornings she'd assumed she was alone at the corral fence, and here was Rhett, somewhere in the gray pre-light, watching without interfering, not checking on her, not supervising, just watching. The way you watch something you're not sure you understand but think you might want to. He's making progress, she said. The bad mornings are getting further apart. Rhett nodded. Tomorrow, then. I'll tell Gideon the corral area is off limits in the morning. He won't like that. No, a beat. He doesn't have to like it. She went to get the lead rope from the tack room, and she heard Rhett behind her go back to his work. The next morning was cold. October deepening toward November now, the mornings carrying a bite that promised what was coming. Brinley went to the corral before first light the same as always, and for a long time she just stood at the fence, and nightfall came to her in his own time, which was less time than it had been on any previous morning. She took that as a sign of something, though she was careful not to read too much into it. Horses didn't run on the same schedule as human hope. She went inside the corral with the lead rope coiled over her shoulder. The gate latch clicked and Nightfall's head came up fast, ears forward, and for a moment he held very still in the way of a creature deciding whether this is the thing that ends the good arrangement. Brinley stood just inside the gate and let him look at her. Same, she said. Still the same. His ears moved, shifted forward, then back, then forward again, reading the voice the way they do. She walked toward him, not in a straight line. She angled, the way you approach something that needs to understand you're not coming at it. Diagonal, easy, weight back, hands down. He watched her come. She stopped 6 feet away, waited. He stretched his neck out toward her. That reaching gesture, tentative, the same one he'd been doing at the fence for a week. And she let him take his time, and then she put her hand on his nose and scratched the flat place between his nostrils, where horses can't reach themselves. His eyes went half-lidded. She uncoiled the lead rope with her other hand, slowly, and let him see it, let him smell it. He stiffened when he saw it, a full body tightening, and she stopped moving and just held it there in view and kept scratching that spot between his nostrils and waited for the tension to come back out of him, which it did, slowly, over the course of several minutes. She looped the lead over his neck first, just the weight of it, not clipped, felt him tense and ease and tense and ease. Kept her hand moving, that same scratch. Then she clipped it. He threw his head. Hard. She felt it in her shoulder when the rope jerked. And she held on without pulling back, which is the counterintuitive thing, the thing that people who don't know horses get wrong every time. Pulling creates a fight. Holding without fighting back creates a confusion that, given a moment, resolves itself. He stopped throwing his head. He stood there, lead rope attached, and blew a long breath out through his nostrils, that sound horses make when they've decided something isn't going to kill them after all. Brinley's shoulder ached where the jerk had pulled it. She was going to feel that for a couple of days. She kept her hand on his neck and breathed. There, she said. There we go. She didn't do anything more with it that morning. She didn't walk him or work him or ask anything further. She just stood there with the lead rope in her hand and the horse at the end of it, and she let that be enough because sometimes enough is what you have, and pushing past it costs more than it gains. What she didn't see, because she was focused on the horse and the morning and her own aching shoulder, was Gideon Pike watching from the gap between the bunkhouse and the feed shed. He watched for several minutes. Then he turned and went back inside. The work of the ranch continued around Brinley's mornings at the corral the way the work of a ranch always continues, indifferent to individual concerns, insisting on its own rhythm. Cattle needed to be checked. The north fence had another section that was failing. The water supply for the east pasture had an issue with the pipe that Cal and Denny spent 3 days digging up and repairing in cold that was turning serious. Brinley worked alongside whatever needed doing. She had not come out to the box C to stand at a corral fence. That was the part of her day that was for the horse and for herself. And the rest of the hours she made herself useful in whatever direction the ranch needed. She restitched a leather harness that had been held together with a prayer and a piece of wire. She renegotiated the supply order with the Frost Creek General Store's delivery man when he came out with the wrong quantities of 2 items and tried to say the order had been placed wrong. It hadn't. She had the written order in her apron pocket, and she showed it to him without heat, and he corrected the delivery without argument, though she could see by his face he wasn't accustomed to that particular experience. Rhett found out about the supply negotiation from Cal, who had witnessed it. He overcharged last time too, Rhett told her at supper. I know. I found the old receipts. She passed the bread. I corrected that as well. He looked at her. He gave the money back? He deducted it from the new delivery. She set the bread down. It's not worth fighting with a man over $10 if you can just make the accounting clear. Rhett ate for a moment. Gideon's been dealing with Pearson at the general store for years. I know. She met his eyes. I'm not trying to take over what's Gideon's. The supply ordering came to me because it made sense, and I did it. If Gideon wants to take it back, he can. He won't. A pause. He hates that kind of thing. Always has. Then it's not a problem. She refilled her coffee. But it was a problem. She could feel it the way you feel weather coming, something in the atmosphere of the place, a pressure that didn't announce itself directly, but was there if you knew how to read it. Gideon had been quiet for 10 days. Not friendly, never that, but quiet. And quiet from Gideon she was beginning to understand was not the same as acceptance. She found out what quiet from Gideon meant on a Thursday night. She came to the corral before dawn on Friday, and nightfall was at the far fence. White-rimmed eyes, head high, trembling across the hindquarters with a tremor so fine it was almost invisible, but she'd learned to see it. One of the bad mornings, but different from the other bad mornings. Worse. More acute. Like something specific had happened rather than some ambient fear surfacing. She checked him over carefully, keeping her voice low and even the whole time. There was nothing physically wrong that she could find. No new injuries, nothing in the feed bucket that shouldn't be there. But he wouldn't come to her. He stood at the far rail and trembled, and his eyes said something happened here in the dark. And I don't know what it was, but I know I should be afraid of it. She went to find Cal. Was anyone out here last night, near the corral? Cal looked up from his breakfast. His expression shifted. A quick thing, gone almost as fast as it appeared, but she caught it. I don't know of anyone. But, he looked at his plate. I heard something around midnight. Thought it was a coyote bothering the horses. What kind of something? A voice. He said it quietly. Couldn't make out the words. Brinley stood in the kitchen doorway for a moment. Then she went back to the corral and spent an hour at the fence. Not inside, not pushing. Just present. Nightfall stayed at the far rail. After an hour she left. She didn't say anything to Rhett that day. She didn't say anything to Gideon. She came back the next morning and the morning after, and by the third morning, Nightfall was back at the near fence again, but not all the way back, not to where they'd been before Thursday night. Something had been reset. Not entirely, not permanently, but reset. The way a bone heals slightly wrong if it's disturbed while it's knitting. She thought about what that meant. About someone standing outside a corral in the dark, deliberately, with intention. She thought about Gideon Pike's flat expression and his careful quiet and the arithmetic she could see him always running. She thought about the gap between the bunkhouse and the feed shed. She didn't confront him. Not yet. She wasn't sure yet what she knew and what she was inferring, and the difference mattered. If she went at Gideon with an accusation she couldn't prove, she'd lose more than she'd gain. She'd look like a woman who blamed the nearest unfriendly man for her problems, and she'd give him exactly the kind of story he wanted to tell about her. So she waited. She kept her mornings at the corral, and she watched Nightfall slowly rebuild toward where he'd been, and she noted the pattern of his bad mornings, how some of them came in clusters, 2 and 3 in a row, and how those clusters aligned with something she couldn't pin down precisely, but which had a rhythm to it that didn't feel like accident. What she hadn't expected was the town. Frost Creek had not forgotten her. She had come into it expecting to be forgotten, to be folded into the category of that woman Calloway married and left there. But the incident with Nightfall had lodged in people's minds in a way that surprised her when she went back to town for the monthly supply run. The woman at the general store, Mrs. Elspeth Garner, who had been among the people on the boardwalk that first day, was the first person to act differently. She helped Brinley fill the supply order without the sideways assessment Brinley had noticed on arrival. She asked after the ranch. She asked, with what seemed like genuine curiosity rather than social performance, how Brinley was settling in. Well enough, Brinley said. Thank you for asking. That was something, Mrs. Garner said. What you did? With the horse. She paused. My daughter was the one in the street, the red braids. Brinley looked at her. She all right? She's fine. She cried for about 2 hours and then she was fine. Children recover faster than we do. Mrs. Garner straightened a stack of canned goods that didn't need straightening. I would have thanked you sooner. I didn't know what to say. You don't have to say anything. I know. A pause. But I wanted to. On the ride back to the Box C, with the supply wagon loaded and the November sky pressing down gray and cold, Brinley thought about Mrs. Garner's face and the way the woman had looked at her. Not with admiration exactly, or not only that, but with a kind of reconsideration, as if she were revising a story she'd already written and finding the revision complicated. It shouldn't have mattered. The opinions of a town that had laughed at her the moment she stepped off a stagecoach shouldn't have carried weight. But she was human, and it did matter more than she wanted it to. Rhett was waiting when she got back. He helped her unload without being asked, which he'd done every supply day since she arrived, and they worked in the efficient parallel of two people who figured out each other's pace. She handed things down from the wagon bed, and he carried them into the kitchen, and neither of them felt compelled to fill the silence with unnecessary words. When the wagon was empty, he leaned against the wheel and said, "Ada's coming for a visit. End of the month." Brinley set the last crate down. "All right. He stopped. Tried again. "She's not an easy child. I don't mean difficult. She's particular. She decides things about people quickly, and she holds to them." "How old is 9?" Brinley said. He blinked. "What?" "How old were you when you were 9? What kind of 9 were you?" He thought about it, with the seriousness he brought to most things. "Stubborn," he said finally. "Certain I knew things I didn't know. Most 9-year-olds are." She picked up the empty crate. "I'm not expecting her to like me. I'm just going to be here and be honest with her and see what happens." "That's it?" "That's it." She headed for the kitchen. "There's no trick to it, Rhett. You either deal straight with children or you don't, and they always know the difference." He didn't say anything to that, but she heard him follow her inside, and there was something in the sound of it, the ordinary sound of a man following a woman into a kitchen after a day's work, that was so domestic and so unremarkable that it startled her with its normalcy. That night, lying in her room with the wind picking up outside, the first real suggestion of winter coming, testing the walls, she took stock of where she was. 6 weeks into a marriage that wasn't quite a marriage yet, in a place that was almost starting to feel like hers, with a horse that was almost starting to trust her, and a foreman who was doing something in the dark that she couldn't yet prove, and a husband who surprised her on a semi-regular basis with the specific quality of his decency, and a 9-year-old girl arriving at the end of the month who had already decided things about her. She lay on her back and looked at the ceiling and listened to the wind. Far away, from the direction of the corral, she heard nightfall. Not panicked, just present, making the low sounds horses make in the night that aren't about anything except the fact of being alive and waiting for morning. She listened until the sound stopped. Then she pulled the blanket up and closed her eyes and tried to sleep. Ada Calloway arrived on a Tuesday, which was an unremarkable day in every other respect. Cold, gray, the kind of flat November light that makes everything look slightly faded, like a photograph left too long in the sun. Rhett drove into Frost Creek to collect her from the afternoon stage, and Brinley stayed at the ranch and did not make any special preparations, because she had decided that special preparations were the wrong instinct. A child who was already suspicious of you didn't need to arrive to a performance. She needed to arrive to something real. So Brinley cooked the same supper she would have cooked anyway. Beef stew, because the weather called for it, and she had the beef. And she kept her afternoon the same as any other afternoon, and when she heard the wagon come into the yard, she finished what she was doing before she went to the door. Ada was small for 9, dark-haired like her father, with Charlotte's eyes. Brinley didn't know what Charlotte's eyes had looked like, but she could see that this child's eyes hadn't come from Rhett, too wide-set and too particular a shade of brown that was almost amber. She stood in the yard beside her small traveling bag and looked at Brinley with an expression of absolute and fearless assessment. Brinley looked back at her. "You're bigger than I thought you'd be," Ada said. Rhett made a sound behind her that might have been a cough. "I get that a lot," Brinley said. "You want to come inside? It's cold." Ada considered this as if it were a negotiation. Then she picked up her bag and walked past Brinley into the house. And Brinley held the door and watched her go and thought, all right then. Supper was not easy. Ada ate with the focused silence of a child who is listening to everything and volunteering nothing, and Rhett filled the gaps with ranch news that was mostly for Ada's benefit. Stories about Denny and Cal, a particular incident with a steer that had gotten into the feed shed. And Brinley ate and didn't try to insert herself and didn't try to charm the child and didn't make any of the bright performative attempts at connection that she had seen adults make with suspicious children, and that always backfired. After supper, Ada helped clear the table without being asked, which told Brinley something. "Is that your horse?" Ada said. She was looking out the kitchen window toward the corral, where nightfall was visible as a dark shape in the last of the evening light. "He belongs to your father." "Papa never goes near him," Ada said it matter-of-factly, without judgment. "He says the horse is troubled." "He's right." "Are you fixing him?" Brinley dried a plate. "I'm trying to." Ada turned from the window. "Can I watch?" "In the morning if you want. Early, though, before breakfast." Ada seemed to weigh whether early before breakfast was an acceptable price. Apparently it was. "All right," she said, and went to find her father. The next morning, Ada was at the kitchen door before Brinley had finished her first cup of coffee. She was dressed and had her hair braided, imperfectly, the left braid looser than the right, and she was wearing a coat 2 sizes too large for her that must have been Charlotte's, or an approximation of it. She didn't say anything. She just stood there ready, which Brinley respected. They went to the corral in the dark together. Nightfall was already at the near fence, a good morning, one of the better ones in recent days, and his breath made small clouds in the frozen air. Ada stood beside Brinley at the fence and was, to her credit, completely still. No sudden movements, no reaching through the rails. She watched. After a few minutes, Nightfall moved toward them. Ada's breath caught. Brinley heard it, but the child held herself still. The horse put his nose to the top rail, and his dark eye regarded them both. "He's looking at me," Ada whispered. "He's deciding about you," Brinley said, quiet. "Give him time." They stood there for a while in the cold. After a bit, Nightfall stretched his nose toward Ada's side of the fence. Ada looked at Brinley, a question on her face. "Slow," Brinley said. "Don't reach. Let him come to your hand." Ada turned her palm up on the rail, the way Brinley had shown her without realizing she was showing her, just by example. Nightfall sniffed. Then the soft, whiskered end of his nose was against Ada's fingers, and the girl went absolutely still, and something moved across her face that Brinley recognized. The specific expression of a person being trusted by something that doesn't trust easily. "He's so soft," Ada said, barely sound at all. "Right there between the nostrils," Brinley said. "They can't reach that spot themselves." Ada scratched it. Nightfall's eyes went half-lidded. They stood there in the frozen pre-dawn, the woman and the child and the black horse, and none of them said anything for a long time, and it was one of the better mornings Brinley could remember in recent history. Ada left Sunday. At the wagon, she looked at Brinley with that same direct amber-eyed assessment she'd arrived with, and then she said, "I'm coming back at Christmas." "I'll be here," Brinley said. It wasn't warmth exactly, not yet, but it was the beginning of something, and beginnings were enough. What came after Ada's visit was harder. Brinley had been keeping her own accounting of Nightfall's bad mornings, dates, conditions, what she'd observed. And the pattern was undeniable once she'd written it out. The bad mornings clustered on Tuesdays and Fridays with a consistency that had nothing to do with weather or the horse's internal rhythms. Something was happening on Monday nights and Thursday nights. Something deliberate. She knew what it was. She'd known for weeks. What she hadn't had was proof she could bring to Rhett without it looking like accusation built on suspicion. She got it on a Thursday. She had not slept. Not because she'd planned to stay awake. She wasn't the kind of person who made dramatic nighttime vigils of things, but because the wind had been bad and her shoulder was aching where Nightfall had jerked the lead rope 3 weeks ago, a low, persistent ache that wouldn't let her fully go under. She was lying in the dark listening to the wind when she heard it. A voice. Low. Coming from the direction of the corral. She was out of bed and had her coat and boots on in less than a minute. She went out the back of the house and around the supply shed, and she moved quietly because the wind covered most of it anyway. And she came around the corner of the feed shed and stopped. Gideon was at the corral fence. He had a coil of rope in one hand and he was making a noise with it, slapping it against the fence rail, a sharp cracking sound, not loud but targeted. And Nightfall was at the far end of the corral, pressed against the fence, trembling. Gideon wasn't shouting. He was talking, low and even, and what he was saying was worse than shouting would have been. "Stupid animal," he said, slap of the rope. You're going to kill someone, and then they'll put you down, and that'll be the end of it. Slap. All this time she's wasting on you. All this, slap. Patience. For what? You're the same as you always were. You'll always be the same. Brinley stood in the dark for a moment. Then she said, Gideon. He turned around. In the dark, she couldn't see his expression fully, just the shape of him going still, the way a man goes still when he's been caught at something he'd calculated he wouldn't be caught at. Brinley. Flat. Recovering. Put the rope down. A pause. I was checking on the horse. Put the rope down. He set it on the fence rail. He was not a man who was easy to shame, and she could see him already reorienting, finding the version of this that put him on solid ground. That horse is dangerous. I've always said, I know what you've always said. She walked up to the fence. Nightfall had turned at the sound of her voice and was watching her from the far end of the corral, still trembling, but with that quality of attention he gave her, now that was different from the attention he gave everything else. I know what you've been doing. I've been keeping track. He looked at her. You've been Tuesdays and Fridays, she said, for 6 weeks. Every time I get him somewhere and every time you come out here and you undo it. That's a serious accusation. It is. She met his eyes. I'm making it seriously. Gideon was quiet. In the dark, with the wind moving around them, she could see him calculating. The same arithmetic she'd watched him run since her first day on the Box C, only now the numbers were different. Now there was a variable he hadn't accounted for. You can't prove that, he said. I can prove the pattern, she said. The dates are written down. Rhett can draw his own conclusions. She paused. Or you can tell me why. Another silence. She waited. That horse is going to get someone killed, Gideon said, finally. Not the belligerent version. Something flatter and older underneath it. I have watched Rhett pour time and money and feeling into an animal that isn't fixable. And now you're out here every morning and you're... He stopped. You make it look like it's working. And then something will go wrong, that animal will go wrong, and it'll be my fault for not stopping it when I could. Brinley looked at him for a long moment. You're afraid, she said. I'm practical. Both things can be true. She turned back to the corral. Nightfall had moved from the far fence and was halfway to her now, step by careful step. What you're doing doesn't make him safer. It makes him worse. Every time you come out here, you confirm for him that this place isn't safe, that the people here aren't safe. You're building the thing you're scared of. Gideon said nothing. If you do it again, she said, I'm going to tell Rhett. Not as a threat, because you need to understand what it costs. She looked at him. It costs 6 weeks of work every time. It costs me and it costs that horse, and eventually it'll cost this ranch. She picked up the rope from the fence rail and walked back to the house. She didn't sleep after that either. She lay on her back and looked at the ceiling and felt the ache in her shoulder and thought about Gideon's face. Not the defensive blankness she'd expected, but that older, flatter thing underneath it. Fear wearing the costume of practicality. She had known people like that her whole life, including, if she was honest, herself at certain points. It didn't make what he'd done acceptable, but it made it legible. She didn't tell Rhett. Not yet. She sat with what she knew for a week, watching to see if Gideon would do it again. He didn't. In that same week, something shifted with Nightfall. She couldn't have said exactly when it happened. Not in a single moment. It wasn't like that, despite what people would later claim when they told the story and collapsed weeks of slow work into a single dramatic scene. It was more like a tide going out. One morning, the edge in him was simply less than it had been the morning before, and the morning after that, less again. And she came to understand that whatever threshold she'd been waiting for him to cross, he'd crossed it quietly when she wasn't watching for it. She put a saddle blanket on him for the first time on a Wednesday. Just the blanket. No saddle. He stamped once, and that was all. She walked him on the lead around the corral, and he walked with her. Not fighting, not testing, just moving. Cal saw it from the fence and didn't say a word, which was the right thing to do. She began walking him outside the corral on Thursday, just along the fence line of the east pasture, back and forth, 40 minutes in the morning. He was suspicious of new ground. His head would come up at anything unusual, a bird, a sound from the barn, but he stayed with her. She put the saddle on him for the first time the following Tuesday. He moved around the corral with it, working through what it meant, and she let him move and didn't try to stop him, and after 20 minutes he settled and she walked him again and he was fine. She didn't try to ride him. Rhett asked about it one evening at supper. So when are you going to get up on him? When he's ready. How will you know? She thought about it. He'll tell me, she said. Not in words, obviously, but you know how animals are. There's a difference between tolerating something and being at peace with it. I'll know. Rhett ate for a moment. Gideon says you're taking too long. I imagine he does. He says the horse is never going to be useful at this rate. Brinley looked at her plate. What do you say? Rhett set his fork down. He looked out the window toward the corral, where nightfall was visible as a dark shape against the lighter dark of the pasture beyond. I say I hired a man from Billings to break that horse, and it took 2 weeks and cost me $200, and at the end of it, the horse was worse than when we started. He picked his fork back up. So I don't have a lot of faith in fast. She didn't say anything, but something in her chest settled at that. The way things settle when a weight you've been carrying shifts to a better position. The explosion she'd been half expecting came on a Thursday afternoon in late November, 4 weeks after she'd confronted Gideon at the corral fence. She heard it from the kitchen, a sound from the direction of the barn, voices elevated, the particular quality that arguments have when they've crossed from disagreement into something more urgent. She wiped her hands and went. Gideon was in the yard between the barn and the corral. He had a bottle in one hand, not a flask, a proper bottle, mostly gone, and he was talking at Cal and Denny, who were standing at a careful distance with the posture of men who are calculating exits. Not going to stand here and let a woman from Ohio tell me how this ranch runs. His voice had the loose, imprecise quality of a man who had been drinking long enough that his volume control was gone. 8 years. 8 years I ran this place. Gideon. Rhett had come out of the barn. His voice was level, but with an edge in it she hadn't heard before. Put the bottle down. Don't you... Gideon pointed at him, an unsteady gesture. Don't you stand there and tell me to put it down like I'm some hand you just brought on. I was here when Charlotte died. I held this place together when you couldn't get out of bed for 2 weeks. Don't you forget that. The yard was very still. Cal and Denny had gone to stone. Rhett's face had done something complicated. She could see it from where she stood, the way that name had landed on him. I know what you did, Rhett said, quietly. I know. Put the bottle down, Gideon. Gideon's face worked. Some of the bluster went out of him, but what replaced it was rawer and uglier. The grief under the anger, which was always worse. She doesn't belong here, he said. He wasn't looking at Rhett anymore. He was looking at Brinley. She doesn't know this place. She doesn't know what it costs to keep it running. She comes in here and she moves things around and she talks to that horse like it's a person, and everyone just... His voice broke on the edge of something, and he controlled it badly. Like everything we did before she got here didn't mean anything. That's not what it means, Brinley said. He looked at her. His eyes were red-rimmed and not entirely focused. The way things were done before I got here kept this ranch alive, she said. That's not nothing. That's not a small thing. She walked across the yard toward him. Not fast, measured. The same way she walked toward nightfall on the bad mornings. I'm not here to replace what you built. I'm here because Rhett needed someone and I needed somewhere. That's all this is. Gideon stared at her. The bottle was still in his hand. I know you've been out there, she said, lower now, so it was just between them. I know what you've been doing, and I know why. I'm not going to pretend I think it was right, but I understand it better than you think I do. A long silence. Then Gideon set the bottle down in the dirt. Not a dramatic gesture. He just set it down, like he'd gotten tired of holding it. He turned and walked toward the bunkhouse. The yard exhaled. Cal and Denny found reasons to be elsewhere within seconds. Rhett stood where he was for a moment, looking at nothing, and then he looked at Brinley, and the question on his face was so plain she could read it without difficulty. He'll be all right, she said. Tomorrow or the next day. Give him time. You knew, Rhett said, about the corral. I found out a few weeks ago. You didn't tell me. I handled it. She met his eyes. Was that wrong? He looked at her for a long moment. The look she'd come to recognize, that rearranging, that slow revision. No, he said finally. I suppose not. She went back to the kitchen. She stood at the window for a moment and looked out at the corral, where Nightfall had come to the near fence and was watching the yard with his ears forward, alert, tracking the aftermath of what he'd heard. She went to him. The afternoon was going gray and cold, and she leaned on the fence and he came to her and she put her hand on his nose. "All right," she told him. "It's all right." But the worst of it wasn't over. She would understand that later. What none of them knew, what Brinley couldn't have predicted even with all her careful watching, was what Gideon would do with the particular cocktail of wounded pride and genuine remorse that was in him by the time he'd sobered up 2 days later. A contrite man was harder to predict than an angry one. An angry man took predictable angles. A man who had been forced to see himself clearly and didn't like what he saw could go in any direction at all. He went back to the corral. Not on a Monday night or a Thursday night. On a Saturday afternoon, while Brinley was in Frost Creek with the wagon getting the monthly supplies, and Rhett was on the North Range checking on a section of fence that had gone down in the overnight wind. Just Gideon and Cal and Denny on the ranch, and Cal and Denny working the east pasture, and Gideon alone in the yard with a rope in his hand and something to prove that he probably couldn't have articulated clearly even to himself. He went into the corral. She found out from Cal afterward in fragments, the way you find out about things that happened when you weren't there, the details coming in the wrong order, the significant and insignificant pieces arriving without context, and you have to assemble it yourself. What Cal knew was that he'd heard the horse scream. He'd heard that from the east pasture, through the wind, and he'd known immediately it wasn't a normal sound. He'd run. What he'd found when he got there was Gideon on the ground inside the corral and Nightfall standing over him. Not standing over him in the way of a horse that has finished what it started and is waiting to continue. Standing over him the way a frightened animal stands when it's run out of direction, trembling all the way through, weight shifting, eyes white and rolling, not attacking but not moving away either, trapped in the blind place between terror and action, where the next second could break either way. Gideon was conscious. His right shoulder was wrong. Dislocated, Cal thought, from the angle of it. And he was bleeding from a cut above his ear. He was not moving. Possibly he had the presence of mind not to, or possibly he was past the point of choosing. Denny had come up behind Cal, and they stood at the fence and looked at the situation, and Cal understood with perfect clarity that there was nothing they could do from outside the corral that wouldn't make it worse. That was when Brinley came back. She'd come back early. Mrs. Garner at the general store had given her a wrong item, and Brinley had caught it loading the wagon and gone back in to correct it, which had put her behind, and she'd pushed the horse harder on the road home to make up time. And she turned into the Box C's yard to find Cal and Denny standing at the corral fence with the rigid posture of men who are trying very hard not to do the wrong thing. She was off the wagon before it fully stopped. "How long?" she said. 10 minutes, Cal said. "Maybe 12. Brinley, his shoulder, I see it." She looked at Nightfall, at Gideon, at the situation. "Get away from the fence," she said. "Both of you. Go to the barn and stay there." "We can't just—" "Go," she said. Not loud. The same voice she used with the horse, the voice that was not a request. They went. She stood at the fence alone. Nightfall's head came around at the sound of her voice, and for a moment, one terrible second, she couldn't read what she saw in his eyes. She had learned to read him over weeks of mornings, learned to distinguish the fear from the confusion from the slow-building trust. And now she looked at him, and what she saw was all of those things compressed into a single unbearable moment, and none of them were winning. She opened the gate. She heard Gideon make the sound. Not words, just a sharp intake of breath that meant no, don't. And she ignored it and stepped into the corral and let the gate swing behind her. Nightfall's head came up. His weight shifted to his hindquarters. The gathering posture, the one that precedes a bolt or a rear, and she knew it, and she kept walking. "Hey," she said. The same word, the same voice, the first word she'd ever said to him. He froze. She kept walking, slow and diagonal, the way she always came to him, weight back and hands down, and she talked as she walked, not to the horse, or not only to the horse, because what came out of her mouth in that moment was not calculated for effect, but was just what was there. "You don't have to be what they made you," she said. "You don't have to carry all of it. Whatever happened to you before this place, and whatever happened at this place, You don't have to keep being that. You can put it down. Her voice was steady, but it cost her something. Her hands were shaking. You can just be here. Right now. Just here with me. Nightfall's breathing was ragged and his sides heaved and his ears went back and forward and back again, and then something happened in the muscle of his neck. A long, slow release, like a fist unclenching, and his head came down 6 inches. She was 10 feet away from him. She stopped. Let that be far enough. That's right, she said. That's exactly right. Gideon had gone very still on the ground. She could see him in her peripheral vision, watching, and she could see the moment he understood, really understood, not as something happening to a horse, but as something happening that he was part of, what he was looking at. Nightfall took a step away from Gideon, then another. He came toward Brinley slowly, his whole body still shaking, and she put her hand up the same way she had on the first day in the middle of Frost Creek's main street. Open palm, not demanding anything. He put his nose in her hand. She stood there and let him breathe and didn't say anything more and didn't move and didn't cry, though she was fairly close to it. Gideon, she said after a while, can you get up? A pause. A sharp sound of pain. I can try. Try slow. He got up slow. His face was gray-white under the blood from the cut, and his right arm was held against his body at the wrong angle, and he moved across the corral with the careful deliberateness of a man discovering exactly how much things hurt. He got to the gate. Cal was there. Of course, Cal hadn't gone to the barn. She hadn't really expected him to. And Cal got the gate open and got Gideon through it, and Gideon stood in the yard and looked back at Brinley through the fence. His face was a thing she wouldn't have known how to describe if someone had asked her. Not shame, exactly. Or not only that, something older and more complicated. The look of a man who has just seen himself very clearly from the outside for the first time in a long time and doesn't know what to do with that. I'll go get Rhett, Cal said. Get the doc first, Brinley said. That shoulder needs to be looked at. Cal went. Denny stayed near the gate, quiet, keeping his distance. Brinley stayed in the corral with Nightfall for a long time. She stood with her hand on his neck and felt the trembling slowly work its way out of him, the way you work cold out of yourself standing close to a fire. Not fast, not all at once, but degree by degree, the temperature of things returning to what it should be. When Rhett arrived at the fence, she looked up at him and he looked at her, and neither of them said anything for a moment. Gideon, he said finally, dislocated shoulder, cut on his head. He'll be fine. Rhett's hands were on the fence rail. She noticed they were white-knuckled, which was the most obvious sign of how he'd come to the yard and what he'd seen and what he'd thought he was going to find. You walked in there, he said. Not an accusation, just the fact of it. I did. With him like that. Yes. Rhett was quiet for a long moment. He looked at the horse, at Nightfall, standing quiet now beside Brinley with his head low and his breathing finally evening out. And he looked at her, and the thing that moved across his face was not something she could name exactly. It was the look of a man being asked to revise something fundamental, something he'd held to for a long time, and finding that the revision is possible. All right, he said. His voice was rough at the edges. All right. The evening came in cold and fast the way November evenings do, and the box sea settled into its nighttime sounds. And in the corral, Nightfall stood quiet under the first stars, and the particular crisis that had been building since Brinley Hartwell stepped off a stagecoach in Frost Creek 6 weeks ago had broken open and passed through and left something behind it that was not peace exactly, but was the ground from which peace, eventually, might grow. The doctor came out from Frost Creek that same evening, a lean, unhurried man named Paulson, who had the particular economy of movement that comes from years of making house calls in bad weather across long distances. He reset Gideon's shoulder in the bunkhouse with Cal and Denny and Rhett present, and the sound of it carried through the walls to where Brinley was in the kitchen, and she kept her hands moving on the bread dough she was working and didn't stop. Gideon did not make much noise. She gave him that. Paulson came into the kitchen afterward for the coffee Brinley had put on when she heard his wagon in the yard. He sat at the table and accepted the cup, and looked at her with the appraising directness of a man who deals in damage and has learned to read its sources. Shoulders back in, he said. He'll need to keep the arm bound for 2 weeks. After that, Light work only for another month. He'll hate that, Brinley said. Most men do. Paulson drank his coffee. The cut on his head is superficial. Head wounds bleed dramatic. This one looked worse than it was. A pause. Cal tells me you went into the corral. Yes. With the horse in that state. Yes. Paulson looked at her for a moment. He was not a man who editorialized, she could tell. He had the stillness of someone who has learned that most of what people say in response to things that frighten them is noise. How's the horse now? He said. Settled. Good. He finished his coffee and stood. You've got arnica in that kit of yours? I do. Good, he said again, and went to get his coat. Rhett walked Paulson to his wagon and came back and stood in the kitchen doorway, and they looked at each other across the room with the slightly dazed quality of two people who have come through something and aren't quite sure yet what it cost them. Gideon wants to talk to you, Rhett said. In the morning, she said. Let him sleep. Rhett nodded. He pulled out the chair at the table, his chair, the one he always sat in, and sat down heavily and put his hands flat on the table and looked at them. She poured him a cup of coffee without being asked and set it in front of him and sat down across from him. He could have killed you, Rhett said. He didn't. Brinley. The way he said her name, not sharp, but weighted, pressed down with something. I need you to understand that I am not, that I can't. He stopped. He was not a man who found this kind of speech easy, and she didn't try to help him find it, because some things a person needs to find themselves. I can't have you taking risks like that without what? He looked at her. Without telling me. She considered that. There wasn't time to tell you. I know that. Today. I know today there wasn't time. He wrapped his hands around the cup. I mean, in general. The nights you were watching Gideon, the weeks you were tracking what he was doing. You were carrying all of that by yourself. I've been carrying things by myself for a while, she said. It's a habit. I know. He looked at the table. I've got the same habit. A pause. It hasn't served me as well as I thought it did. Outside, the wind had picked up. November wind in Montana has a specific character, purposeful, like it's going somewhere and everything in the way is an inconvenience. The kitchen windows rattled slightly in their frames. I should have told you about Gideon sooner, she said. That's fair, and I should have... He stopped again, started differently. Charlotte used to say I made the ranch into a place where she was a guest, that she was living in my decisions instead of making them with me. He looked up. I didn't understand what she meant until after she was gone. Brinley sat with that for a moment. The kitchen was warm and the wind was outside and the coffee was cooling between them. I'm not Charlotte, she said. Not unkindly. No. Something in his face shifted. I know that. But I take your point, she said. We can try to do better. He looked at her with that quality she'd come to know, that slow, honest recalibration, and nodded once. They sat in the kitchen for a while longer and didn't say much else, and the wind built around the house, and that was, in its ordinary way, the closest they had come yet to an honest conversation about what they were building together. Gideon came to find her the next morning. His arm was in the sling Paulson had left, and the cut on his head had been cleaned and dressed, and he looked like a man who had not slept and had spent the hours of not sleeping doing hard work of a different kind. He stood in the kitchen doorway while she was starting the breakfast fire, and didn't come in until she looked at him and waited. He sat down at the table. She put coffee in front of him. I owe you an apology, he said. He said it the way a man says something he has rehearsed and is committed to getting through regardless of how it feels. For the corral, for what I was doing. He looked at the coffee cup. For a lot of it. Brinley sat down across from him. All right. I'm not good at... He made a gesture with his good hand. I don't do this easily. I can see that. What I said was true. About Charlotte. About holding this place together. He looked up, and she could see that what was in his face was not self-justification. He'd gotten past that sometime in the night. But that doesn't make the rest of it right. And I know that. I know you know it, she said. I was wrong about the horse. He said it flat and direct, the way a man commits to an admission when he's decided to make it all the way. I don't I'm not sure I understand what you're doing with him, but I was wrong. She looked at him. Why did you go in there yesterday? His jaw tightened. He looked at the window. I don't know, he said. I've been asking myself that since last night. A long pause. I think I wanted to prove something, that I wasn't... He stopped. That what I'd been doing hadn't made things worse, that the horse was always going to be this way, and it wasn't... He stopped again. Wasn't your fault? She said. He didn't answer that, but his shoulders dropped about a quarter inch, which was its own answer. You've been here 8 years, she said. You've kept this ranch alive through things I don't know about, and probably some I do. That's real. It doesn't disappear. She leaned forward slightly. I'm not here to erase what came before, but Gideon, if you keep working against what I'm doing with that horse, you're going to get yourself killed, and that would be a waste. He looked at her, a long, measuring look. You're a strange woman, he said. Not an insult. More like a conclusion he'd arrived at. I've been told. Something shifted in his face. Not warmth, not yet, and maybe not ever. They were not the kind of people who would be warm with each other easily, but something that was the absence of opposition, something that was simply coexistence, offered and accepted. I'll stay out of it, he said. The horse. Thank you. He drank his coffee and she started breakfast, and they didn't talk much more, but the silence between them was different from what it had been, less pressurized, less full of calculations neither of them was voicing. December came. With it came the first serious cold. Not the testing cold of November, but the committed cold of a Montana winter settling in for its full tenure. The ground froze hard, and the water troughs needed breaking every morning, and the cattle drifted to the south-facing slopes where whatever warmth the winter sun offered pooled briefly before the shadows took it back. Ada came for Christmas as she had promised. She arrived with the particular energy of a child who has been looking forward to something and is working hard not to show how much. She went to Nightfall's corral before she went inside the house, and Brinley let her and watched from the kitchen window as the small, dark-haired girl and the large black horse stood at the fence in the thin winter light and made their own private arrangement. Christmas itself was imperfect in the way that holidays usually are when the people celebrating them are still learning each other. Ada spilled gravy on the table and cried about it with a ferocity disproportionate to the event, which Brinley understood was not about the gravy. Rhett burned the top of the cornbread. Gideon came to dinner, which Brinley had asked him to, and which he attended with the careful manners of a man who has made a decision to try, and he and Ada got on better than anyone had predicted, likely because Ada was 8 years past the age of being charmed by adult performances, and Gideon, whatever his faults, did not perform. After dinner, Ada sat with Brinley at the kitchen table while Rhett and Gideon sat by the fire, and Ada said, with a directness that was apparently a Calloway family characteristic, "Do you love my father?" Brinley considered the question with the seriousness it deserved. "I think I'm getting there," she said. Ada processed this. "He likes you," she said. "He talks about you in his letters. He doesn't think I notice, but I do." "What does he say?" "He says you're capable." Ada said it with a slight emphasis that suggested she found this word both accurate and insufficient, and that you're not afraid of things. "I'm afraid of things," Brinley said. Ada looked at her. "Like what?" "Like failing at something I care about," she said. "Like getting things wrong when the stakes are high." She paused. "Like people I've just started to..." She stopped, looked at the child. "Like losing people who are starting to matter." Ada absorbed this. She was quiet for a moment, which was unusual for her. "My mother was afraid too," she said. "Papa told me. He said she was afraid of the winters mostly. She never got used to them." "She sounds like she was brave anyway," Brinley said. "Papa says that." Ada picked at a thread on her sleeve. "I don't remember her very much. Is that bad?" "You were 5 when she died," Brinley said. "That's not bad. That's just how memory works at 5. Ada looked at her with those amber eyes. "Will you remember me?" she said. "If something happens." Brinley looked at the child straight on. "Nothing's going to happen," she said. "And yes, obviously." Ada seemed satisfied with that. She went to find her father. Brinley sat at the kitchen table for a moment by herself. Outside the window, the December dark was complete, and the stars were extraordinary in the way they get in Montana in winter, the cold making them brilliant and very near, and somewhere out in the corral, Nightfall would be standing in whatever private arrangement horses make with winter nights. She thought about fear and memory and the things that last. She started to ride Nightfall in January. It was not a dramatic event. It had been building toward it for weeks. The saddle, then the weight of her leaning across him, then her foot in the stirrup, then her up and immediately back down. Each step taken and held long enough for him to understand it was not a threat before the next step was taken. When she finally sat fully in the saddle and stayed there, he walked forward on his own, which was not what she'd expected, and she let him walk, and they went around the corral twice before she asked him to stop. Cal was at the fence. He didn't cheer or make any production of it. He just said, "Well," and she could hear everything that was in that single word. She rode him in the corral for 2 weeks, then along the east fence line, then out on the south pasture with the winter ground frozen hard under his hooves and the mountains visible on the clear days like something painted on the far edge of the world. He was not an easy ride. He was never going to be an easy ride. That was not what he was, and she had never been trying to make him into something he wasn't. He was responsive to a degree that required constant attention, sensitive to everything, still prone to shying at sudden sounds or movements, still carrying some residue of whatever had been done to him before Rhett bought him. But he was there, under all of it, present and willing and trying, which was all she had ever asked. Rhett watched her ride out on the south pasture one afternoon, and he stood at the fence in the cold for a long time after she'd gone, and Cal found him there later and said, "She's something, your wife." And Rhett said, "I know," in the quiet way of a man who is understanding something he should have understood sooner. It was in the 3rd week of January that the weather turned serious. It had been cold all winter, properly cold, but functional cold, the kind that makes work hard without making it impossible. What came in on a Thursday night was different. The temperature dropped 40 degrees between sunset and midnight, and the wind shifted to the northwest and brought with it the kind of snow that doesn't fall so much as drive, horizontal and dense and purposeful, the kind that turns familiar landscape into something unrecognizable in 20 minutes. Brinley woke to the sound of it at 2 in the morning and lay there for a moment gauging it, the pitch of the wind, the sound of the snow against the window, the quality of the cold in the room despite the banked fire in the kitchen. She got up and added wood to the fire and stood at the window and looked out at nothing, because there was nothing to see. Just white in all directions, the lantern by the barn barely visible as a smear of light. She went back to bed, but not back to sleep. At dawn, she found Rhett already in the kitchen, dressed for outside, standing at the window with his coffee and his jaw set in a way she'd learned to read as controlled worry. "How bad?" she said. "Worse than last year's February storm." He set the cup down. "I've got 2 groups of cattle out. The north herd on the ridge pasture, and about 30 head Cal moved to the upper south pasture last week." He was already pulling his coat on. "The north ridge is the problem. That's exposed ground. If those cattle don't get moved to shelter, they'll be dead by tonight." "Who goes?" "Me and Cal. Denny stays here to keep the home herd sorted and the water broken." He was checking his coat fastenings. "Should take 4 hours, 5 at the most." She looked at the window. "That's a long time in this." "I know." He didn't say don't worry or it'll be fine. She had noticed early on that he did not make those kinds of assurances, and she had come to understand it as a form of respect, treating her as someone who could handle the accurate version of things. "I know where the sheltered route is. We'll be all right." He and Cal rode out at first light, and the storm swallowed them within 50 feet of the barn. Brinley kept the fire and kept the water broken and kept moving, because the alternative to movement in a situation like this is the slow accumulation of dread, and she knew from experience that dread was more dangerous than cold. She worked alongside Denny, who was capable and quiet and uninclined to fill silence with reassurance he couldn't back up, which she appreciated. By noon, the storm had gotten worse. By 2 in the afternoon, Rhett had not come back. At 3, Denny came into the kitchen with snow still on his shoulders and looked at her with a face carefully arranged to conceal what was behind it, which told her more than any expression would have. "The North Ridge Trail," he said. "There was a washout 2 weeks back on the east side of it. Rhett said they'd go around, but what? In this visibility, you could go around wrong and come out on the shelf section." He stopped. She could see him deciding how much to say. "The shelf section has a drop on the east side, 20 feet, maybe more, onto rock." She stood still for a moment. How long ago would they have been at the North Ridge? Should have been there by 9 this morning, back by 1. 2 hours late, in a storm that was still building. She thought about options. A systematic consideration, not panic, because panic spent energy without producing information, and she needed information. Denny couldn't go after them. He was the only other person on the ranch, and if something happened to him, the livestock would die, and there'd be no one to raise the alarm. She could ride for Frost Creek for help, but that was 6 miles in this, and by the time she got there and came back with anyone, the temperature would be 10 degrees colder, and the light would be failing. She thought about the shelf section and the 20-foot drop onto rock, and she thought about Rhett's hands flat on the kitchen table, and Ada's amber eyes, and the particular quality of his voice when he said her name. She went to the tack room. Denny followed her. He stood in the doorway while she pulled Nightfall's saddle off the rack. Brinley, I know. She got the blanket. You can't. I need you to think about which way they would have gone if the trail was blocked. She looked at him. If they couldn't go around on the east, which way? He blinked, made himself think rather than argue, which she'd known he would. He was practical, Denny, fundamentally practical. West Loop, he said. It's longer, comes up on the north side of the ridge, but it passes through the Henderson Draw, and in this kind of snow that draw can drift to 8-10 feet. So they might be stuck in the draw. Maybe. Or they found shelter at the Henderson's line shack and they're waiting it out. How far is the Henderson line shack from the draw? 1/2 mile north. She did the arithmetic. The line shack was 2 miles east of the road to the Patterson Ranch. The Patterson Ranch was where the nearest significant help was. 8 men, horses, equipment. If she could get to Patterson and raise them, they could approach the draw from the north, and if Rhett and Cal were in the shack, they'd find them. If they weren't in the shack, the combined group could cover more ground. She carried the saddle to Nightfall's corral. The horse was at the far fence in the storm, head down, snow already gathering on his back. She came in through the gate, and he came to her immediately. Not because he was calm, she could see he wasn't calm. The storm was in his bones the way it was in everything's bones. But because she was the thing he came to, and that was different from calm. She got the blanket on him. He stamped and shifted, but stayed. She got the saddle on him. He blew out hard through his nostrils, a long expulsion of resistance that was not quite refusal. I know, she told him. I know it's bad out there. I need you anyway. She tightened the cinch. I need you, she said again. Rhett needs you. He turned his head and looked at her with one dark eye, and she could see in it everything she'd learned to read over these months. The fear that was always there, the trust that had been built on top of it, the question that animals ask with their whole bodies. Is this safe? Is this person safe? She put her hand on his nose. Yes, she said, as if he'd asked it out loud. She mounted. He stood for the mounting, which she had not been certain he would in these conditions. He trembled under her. She could feel it through the saddle. But he stood. Denny was at the gate. His face had given up on concealing things. Straight east to the Patterson Road, he said. Don't cut north until you hit the fence line or you'll miss it. I know. In this visibility, you'll feel the fence before you see it. Denny. He stopped. Keep the fire and keep the water broken, she said. We'll be back. She put her heels to Nightfall's sides, and he went. The world outside the corral was white in every direction, and the wind was a physical thing, not a weather condition, but an entity with intention, pressing against them constantly, finding every gap in her coat and driving snow into every space. She could see maybe 10 feet ahead. She knew the road to the east fence line the way she knew it because she had ridden it in daylight 100 times and had been building the map of it in her body since January. And she trusted that map now because there was nothing else to trust. Nightfall was terrified. She could feel it, the high-strung trembling, the way his ears moved constantly tracking sounds she couldn't hear, the way his stride had a held-back quality like a horse that wants to bolt and is choosing not to. But he was choosing not to. That was the thing. Beneath the fear was the choice, and the choice was her. And she felt the weight of that more clearly than she felt the cold. Good, she told him, into the wind that took her words immediately. Good. Keep going. She found the east fence line by feel, the way Denny had said, her right leg brushing the post before she saw it, and she turned north and followed it. The drifts were bad here. some of them knee-deep on nightfall, and he worked through them with a steady deliberateness that cost him and that he gave anyway. She lost track of time. It compressed in the storm the way time does when you're moving through something difficult, minutes feeling longer and also somehow empty, as if duration and experience had uncoupled from each other. She counted fence posts when she could find them. She talked to Nightfall continuously, not words mostly, just sound, something for him to track other than the wind. The Patterson Road came up on her left when she had almost stopped believing it would. She turned onto it and put Nightfall into a faster walk. Not a trot, not in these drifts, but faster. And the fence along the road gave her direction when her eyes couldn't, and they made the quarter-mile to the Patterson Ranch gate in what felt like an hour and was probably 15 minutes. The yard was lit, and there were figures moving. The storm had everyone up. She came through the gate, and a man came out of the barn and looked at her and then looked again because what he was seeing was a woman on a black horse coming out of a blizzard alone, which was not a thing you expected. "I need men," she said. Her voice had gone strange in the cold, rougher than usual. "Rhett Calloway's missing, North Ridge, Henderson Draw area. I need men, and I need them now." The man looked at her for 1 second. Then he turned and shouted toward the barn. They went out 6 strong, 4 Patterson hands and the Patterson brothers, Hector and Will, who knew the country north of the draw the way you know country you've worked for 20 years. Brinley rode with them. When Hector Patterson said, "You should stay here, get warm," she looked at him and he did not say it again. Nightfall had been going for 2 hours and he should have been done, and he wasn't. She could feel the tiredness in him. It was different from the fear trembling, deeper and more honest. But when she asked him for more, he gave it, each time, with the stubbornness of something that has decided what it's committed to and intends to see it through. They found Rhett and Cal in the Henderson Draw. Not in the line shack, they hadn't made it that far. Cal's horse had gone down in a drift and twisted its leg badly. And Cal had gotten the horse up, but the animal couldn't be ridden. And Rhett had stayed with him rather than go for help alone, because that was the kind of man he was. They'd found a cut in the draw wall that blocked some of the wind, and they were there, both of them on their feet, both of them cold in the specific way that a body gets cold when it has been standing in a blizzard for 4 hours, which is more severe than the temperature alone would suggest. Rhett looked up when the riders came over the drift, and his face when he saw her, when he identified her, specifically her, on the black horse coming through the white, was something she kept. She dismounted before Nightfall had fully stopped and went to him, and he grabbed her arms and she grabbed his, and neither of them said anything, because there wasn't anything to say that would have been adequate. "Nightfall," he said, finally. His voice was wrong from the cold. He was looking past her at the horse. "He brought me here," she said. Rhett looked at the horse for a long moment. Nightfall stood in the draw with the snow on his back and his sides heaving with the effort of what he'd done. And he looked back at Rhett with those dark eyes. "All right," Rhett said. His voice broke slightly on it. "All right." The ride back to the Patterson Ranch was easier, with the group together and the horses following the horses and the wind at their backs instead of their faces. Cal's horse limped but walked, which was better than it could have been. Nobody talked much. In bad weather, you save your breath for breathing. They warmed at the Patterson fire for an hour before Rhett said they needed to get back to the Box C. And the Pattersons said they'd ride escort, and did, all the way to the Box C gate, which was the kind of thing neighbors do when they live in a country that will kill you, and they know it. Denny had the fire enormous and the kitchen hot and soup on the stove, and when they came through the door, he looked at all of them, and at Nightfall being led to the barn, and something moved across his face that was not a word. Brinley got Nightfall unsaddled and rubbed down and blanketed with every blanket she could find, and gave him extra feed and water, and stood with him in the barn for 20 minutes, leaning her forehead against his neck. "Thank you," she said. He breathed into her hair. She went inside and ate soup and got warm by degrees and sat at the table across from Rhett, who had color back in his face finally, and looked at him and felt something settle in her chest that had been unsettled since 2 in the afternoon. "You rode out in that," he said. "On him." "Yes." "In a blizzard." "You were gone 4 hours past when you should have been back." He looked at her. The kitchen was warm and the storm was still going outside and the lamp was lit on the table between them. He looked at her the way he'd looked at her in the draw. Direct, unguarded, without the usual distance that a person keeps between themselves and what they feel. "Brinley," he said. I know, she said. He reached across the table and put his hand over hers. His hand was still cold. She turned hers over and held it. They sat like that for a long time, while the blizzard spent itself against the walls of the box C and the fire worked at the cold, and outside in the barn, a black horse stood quiet in the dark, resting, having done what was needed and nothing more and everything more, depending on how you counted such things. The blizzard blew itself out by Friday morning, leaving behind a world that was white and silent and restructured. Familiar landmarks buried or altered, fence lines invisible under 4-foot drifts. The road to Frost Creek a suggestion rather than a fact. The Box C emerged from it intact, which was not a small thing. 2 of the Patterson Ranch's outbuildings had lost their roofs. A homesteader 3 miles north had lost his entire chicken flock and most of his feed supply. The storm had the particular indifference of Montana winters. It didn't select its damage, it just arrived and left, and you counted what remained. Red had come through it with frostbite on 2 fingers of his left hand, and a rib that Paulson, when he came out the following week, confirmed was cracked rather than broken, which was the better of the 2 possibilities. Cal's horse had a tendon injury that would keep him out of work for 6 weeks, but would, Paulson said, heal clean if they were careful. Cal himself was fine, cold sick for 2 days and then fine, the resilience of a young man's body asserting itself without drama. Rhett did not talk much about the ride Brindley had made. He was not a man who processed things aloud, and she had learned not to require that of him, but she noticed that in the days following the storm, he moved through the ranch differently. Something in the way he occupied spaces, stood in doorways, looked across the yard, less like a man who was managing a situation and more like a man who understood he was part of one. He came to find her at the corral fence on the 3rd morning after the storm, when the temperature had come back up enough that standing outside didn't require an act of will. Nightfall was at the near fence. Rhett leaned on the rail beside her, and they stood together without talking for a while. Hector Patterson came by yesterday, he said finally. While you were in town. What did he want? To talk about you, mostly. A pause. He said, his words, that he had never seen anyone ride like that in weather like that. Said you came into his yard out of that blizzard like you'd just come in off a dry summer road. I was terrified the whole time, she said. I know. He was quiet a moment. That's what makes it what it is. She looked at him. He was looking at the horse. Hector's wife told Elspeth Garner, he said. Elspeth Garner told everyone else. A slight pause that might have been the beginning of something that was almost humor. Frost Creek is reconsidering some things. Brindley thought about the day she'd arrived, the laughter on the main street, the deputy's look when he'd said, "You're bigger than I expected," the way the town had arranged itself along the boardwalks to assess her as a curiosity, as entertainment, as something that didn't fit their existing categories and was therefore worth laughing at. She thought about all of it and found, to her own mild surprise, that it had receded to a distance where she could look at it without the cold settling in the way it had that first day. Not gone. She didn't think it would ever be entirely gone, but smaller than it had been and further away. Towns reconsider things when it suits them, she said. They do, Red agreed. That doesn't mean the reconsidering doesn't count. She thought about that. No, she said. I suppose it doesn't. Nightfall pushed his nose against her hand through the rail. She scratched that spot between his nostrils, and his eyes went half-lidded, and Rhett watched this with an expression she had no word for. Or rather, she had the word but hadn't said it yet, to herself or to anyone. I want to ride him into town, she said. Rhett looked at her. Not to make a point, she said. Or not only that. I want to go into Frost Creek on that horse and do the supply run and come back. He's ready for it. He needs more varied ground, more exposure to the things that used to frighten him. She paused. And maybe I need it too. Rhett looked at Nightfall for a moment. Then he said, All right. You're not going to argue that it's too soon? Would it change your mind? No. Then there's not much point in arguing. He pushed off the fence. I'll come with you. She looked at him. You don't need to. I know I don't need to. He said it simply, without making anything large of it. I want to. She rode Nightfall into Frost Creek on a Thursday in early February, with Rhett on his bay gelding beside her, and the winter rode hard and clear under Nightfall's hooves. The horse was alert the whole ride, ears tracking, stride carrying that held back qualities she'd learned to read as attention rather than anxiety. But he was with her, consistently, continuously with her, checking back every few minutes with a tilt of his head that she answered each time with a slight steadying of her leg. When they came into the main street, a few people stopped what they were doing. Not all of them. Frost Creek had business to attend to, and a Thursday in February was not a ceremonial occasion, but enough of them stopped that she was aware of it. The deputy outside the post office, Mrs. Garner in the doorway of the general store, 2 men at the hitching post outside the feed store who looked up and kept looking. Nightfall walked down the center of that street with his head up and his ears forward and his stride steady, and Brinley sat him the way she sat everything, straight, balanced, not performing ease, but not faking it either. And he passed the spot where he'd come screaming around the corner of the feed store 4 months ago, and he didn't even flick an ear at it. Mrs. Garner came out of the general store as Brinley was tying Nightfall at the hitching post. "Is that—" She stopped, looked at the horse. "That's the Calloway horse." "Yes." "The one that—" She stopped again. "Yes," Brinley said. "Same horse." Mrs. Garner looked at Nightfall, who regarded her with the calm assessment of an animal that has decided most things don't warrant his alarm anymore. Then she looked at Brinley, and something in her expression was the completion of a thought she'd been working on since October. "Come in out of the cold," she said. "I'll put coffee on." Brinley tied off the lead and followed her inside. They drank coffee at the counter while Rhett handled the supply list, and Mrs. Garner asked about the storm, and about Cal's horse, and about Ada's Christmas visit with the slightly roundabout interest of a woman who wants to know the real news and has learned that direct questions often produce less of it than oblique ones. Brinley answered what she asked and offered a little more than what was asked, because Mrs. Garner had earned that with her particular honesty the day she'd told Brinley about her daughter and the rag doll. "People talk about you," Mrs. Garner said at a certain point. "Not gossipy. Factual." "I imagine they do." "Not the way they did when you arrived." She turned her coffee cup in her hands. "It's different now. What they say." A pause. "I don't know if that matters to you." Brinley considered it honestly. "Some," she said. "Not as much as I thought it would." Mrs. Garner nodded. She seemed to understand the distinction. "You stayed," she said. "A lot of people said you wouldn't." "A lot of people said that about the horse, too." Mrs. Garner looked out the window at Nightfall at the hitching post, standing patient and still in the February cold. "Yes," she said. "I suppose they did." When Brinley came out of the general store, the deputy, his name was Colum, she'd learned since October, Colum Adder, 15 years in Frost Creek, 2 daughters, a wife who made the best pie in the county, was standing near the hitching post looking at Nightfall with the cautious respect of a man who has reassessed something. "Mrs. Calloway," he said. "Colum." He looked at the horse. "He looks different." "He is different." Colum turned his hat in his hands, which was apparently what he did when he was working toward something. "I wanted to say what happened in October, when he came through town." He stopped. I could have done something before you did. I should have." She looked at him. He was a man in his 40s who had spent 20 years being the authority in a small town, and what she could see in his face was that admitting this had cost him something real. "You did fine," she said. "You gave me your knife when I asked for it." He blinked. He seemed to consider whether to argue the point and decided not to. "I suppose I did." "It was what I needed," she said. "So?" He nodded, turned his hat again. "You're all right out there? At the Box C?" "We're all right." "Good," he said. "Good," and went back to the post office. Eats. Rhett came out with Cal and loaded the wagon, and they rode back to the Box C with the winter afternoon going gold on the hills and Nightfall moving easy and steady on the road, and neither Rhett nor Brinley said much, but the silence had the quality of 2 people who have run out of things they need to prove and have arrived at something simpler on the other side of that. Gideon was waiting in the yard when they got back. He had been different since November, not transformed. She was skeptical of transformations, having seen what they usually actually were, which was the same person with a new performance overlaid on the same habits, but different in ways that were incremental and therefore more trustworthy. He'd stopped testing her in the small daily ways he'd done through October. He'd started deferring to her on the supply and medical matters without the slight delay that used to signal his recalculation. He'd taken up a habit of checking on nightfall in the morning, from outside the corral, not approaching, just looking, that she thought he probably didn't know she'd noticed. He helped unload the wagon without being asked, working one-armed still, the shoulder not yet back to full capacity. And when the wagon was empty, he stood in the yard with his good hand on the side of the wagon bed and said, without preamble, "I'm leaving in the spring." Rhett looked at him. I'm not leaving angry," Gideon said. He had the same quality he'd had the morning after the corral incident, the quality of a man who has rehearsed something and is committed to getting through it. "I've been thinking about it since November. My brother's got a place outside of Miles City. He's been after me to come help him build it up." He looked at the wagon. "I think it's time." Rhett was quiet. 8 years is a long time, Gideon said. "Maybe too long. Sometimes you stay somewhere past when you should, and you stop being useful and start being," he looked for the word, "furniture." "You were never furniture," Rhett said. "I was getting there." Gideon finally looked at Brinley directly. He did not do it easily. She could see it cost him, but he held it. "This is a good ranch," he said. "It's going to be a better one." A pause. "I'm sorry for the trouble I made." She met his eyes. "You were afraid of losing something that mattered to you," she said. "I understand that. That's—" He seemed briefly exasperated by her ability to provide the charitable interpretation. "You don't have to—" "I'm not being generous," she said. "I'm being accurate." He looked at her for a moment. Then something shifted in his face. Not warmth. They were never going to be warm with each other in the easy way, but something genuine, something that acknowledged that the last 4 months had changed his accounting of her in ways he hadn't expected and couldn't entirely articulate. "All right," he said, and went inside. Rhett stood in the yard for a moment after Gideon went in. He looked out at the hills. "He'll be fine in Miles City," Brinley said. "I know." A pause. "He saved this ranch twice, during the bad winter of '78 and again the year after Charlotte died." He was quiet. "He's not an easy man. Most people who've held things together under pressure aren't." Rhett turned and looked at her, and in the late afternoon light, with the winter hills behind him and the box C yard around them, his face had an openness to it that she'd seen building for months. The slow erosion of the distance a person keeps around themselves when they've been hurt enough times. "No," he said. "I suppose not." Spring came the way Montana springs do, argumentative and late, promising warmth and then pulling it back. The snow coming twice more in March before April finally settled the matter. The hills went from white to brown to a green so sudden and violent it startled her every morning at the kitchen window, as if the land had been holding it back all winter and finally couldn't anymore. Gideon left on a Thursday in early April. He packed what he had into a wagon, which was not much. A man who has worked on other people's land for 8 years doesn't accumulate heavily, and shook Rhett's hand and nodded at Cal and Denny, and then turned to Brinley. He held out his hand. She shook it. "You're going to do well here," he said. "So will you," she said. He nodded, once, and climbed onto his wagon and drove out of the Box C gate without looking back. And something that had been a pressure in the atmosphere of the ranch since October went with him, and what replaced it was a kind of lightness that took a day or two to fully settle, like a room after a window is opened. Ada came for spring, which had not been the original arrangement but had become the arrangement through a series of letters between Ada and Brinley that had started in January. Ada's letters full of questions about nightfall and the ranch, and also, increasingly, about other things, and Brinley's letters answering all of them with the straight-on directness that Ada had apparently decided she preferred. She arrived in April and was taller than she'd been at Christmas, as children are when you see them after a gap, the growth happening all at once between viewings. She dropped her bag in the yard and went immediately to Nightfall's corral, and then she came back and stood in front of Brinley and said, "Can I ride him?" "In a few weeks," Brinley said, "if he's ready." "How will you know if he's ready?" "He'll tell me." Ada processed this with the particular expression of a 9-year-old who is filing away something she intends to think about later. "How do you know what he's saying?" You learn to listen to the right things, Brinley said. Not what you want to hear, what's actually there. Ada looked at her. Is that just about horses? Brinley looked back at her. No, she said. It's not just about horses. Ada was quiet for a moment. Then, I wrote to Papa that I want to come for summer too. I know. He told me. Is that all right? Brinley looked at this child, this particular amber-eyed, too direct child, who had decided things about people quickly and held to them, and who had apparently decided something about Brinley that Brinley was still getting used to. Yes, she said. It's all right, more than all right. Ada nodded, satisfied, and went inside. Rhett was in the barn when Brinley found him that evening. He was working on a piece of tack, the same meditative relationship with leather and tools that she'd learned meant he was thinking through something, using his hands to run the thinking parallel too. Ada wants to stay for summer, she said. I know. He didn't look up from the stitching. What do you think? I think she should. She leaned against the stall. She's been in Billings with Charlotte's sister for 4 years. That made sense when it was just you here. It makes different sense now. He was quiet for a moment. She watched his hands move. It's a big change. Yes. For all of us. Yes. She paused. Do you not want it? He looked up then, and the answer on his face was so plain, so unguarded, the face of a man who has spent 4 years being careful about what he let himself want and has gotten tired of it, that she felt it in her chest. I want it, he said. I want it a lot. She nodded. She looked out the barn door at the spring evening, the green hills and the big Montana sky, and the corral where nightfall was standing in the last of the light. Then that's what we'll do, she said. She rode nightfall into May and June, and the summer came on full, and the Box Sea ran the way a ranch runs when the people on it have figured out how to work together. Not without difficulty, not without the constant negotiation that any living thing requires, but with a fundamental coherence, an understanding of what they were all part of. She learned what Rhett wouldn't say to her directly by watching what he did. She learned that he got up earlier than he needed to just to have the hour of quiet before the work started. She learned that he carried guilt about Charlotte the way a person carries a limp, not constantly in evidence, but present in certain weathers, certain moods, certain late evenings when Ada said something that had Charlotte in it, and Rhett went still for just a moment before he answered. She learned not to try to fix this, because it wasn't a thing that fixed. It was a thing that was part of him, and the part of her that had her own quiet weather understood that. He learned her too. He learned that her directness was not the same as coldness, that her self-sufficiency was not the same as not needing him, and that when she went quiet in the evenings, it was not unhappiness but thinking, the same as him, the same as his hands on tack in the barn when something needed working through. He learned that she was funnier than she seemed, in a dry, quiet way that came out sideways when you least expected it. He learned that she was harder on herself than she was on anyone else, which was both a strength and a vulnerability, and that she didn't like to be seen being either. They were not, in the conventional sense, a romantic story. There was no moment of operatic declaration, no single night when everything shifted and became something else. What they were was two people learning each other honestly, in the daily accumulation of small truths. The way he handed her coffee in the morning without being asked. The way she saved the last of the good tobacco for his evening pipe without mentioning it. The way they could cross a room toward the same task and move around each other without collision. The way he said her name sometimes. Just Brinley. Not to get her attention, but because he was saying it. That is the slower kind of love. The kind that doesn't announce itself. The kind that you find you're already in the middle of before you've realized you were walking toward it. Nightfall became a working horse, not in the way that word is usually meant, not broken to the rein and dull to the heel, not the flattened-out version of himself that the Billings breaker had been trying to produce. He was a working horse in the sense that he had work he was willing to do and did it well, and the work involved a relationship with Brinley that anyone watching could see was particular and specific and not transferable to anyone else. Cal could handle him, and Ada could lead him, and Rhett could brush him and feed him and stand at his fence without incident. But when Brinley came into the corral, he came to her, always, in the way that things come to the thing that is their fixed point. On a Tuesday in August, Ada rode him for the first time. Brinley stood in the center of the corral and held the lead, and Ada sat in the saddle, too big for her, her legs barely past the flap, with the same absolute stillness she'd shown the very first morning at the fence, understanding instinctively that this was one of the things that required her best self. Nightfall walked. Ada sat. And the horse with the history of terror and the child with the two direct amber eyes went around the corral together in the August afternoon like it was the most ordinary thing in the world. Rhett was at the fence. Brinley glanced at him once, and what she saw on his face she kept, the same way she'd kept his face in the Henderson draw, a thing too complete for description, a man in the middle of more than he'd let himself hope for. "He's so smooth," Ada called from the saddle. "He's not smooth," Brinley called back. "You're balanced. There's a difference." Ada's face split into a grin, and Nightfall walked on, and the summer went around them. The story of what happened in Frost Creek that October became the story people told. Not immediately. Stories take time to settle into their final form, time to be told enough times that the essential truth of them survives the retelling. But by the following year, by the second winter, it had taken shape. People talked about the woman who had stepped in front of a terrified horse when everyone else ran. They talked about the horse that had stood over a man and chosen not to hurt him, and the woman who had walked into that corral alone. They talked about the blizzard ride to the Patterson Ranch, the black horse through the white storm, the woman who had come out of it with a man she'd brought back alive. What the story meant varied depending on who was telling it, the way stories do. Some people told it as a story about courage. Some told it as a story about stubbornness, which in Montana is sometimes the same thing. Some told it, quietly, as a story about what fear looks like when it puts on the costume of danger, and how you have to be paying close attention to tell the difference. Brinley, if she had been asked to say what it was about, and occasionally people did ask, in the careful way that people ask things they suspect will get a complicated answer, would have said something different. She would have said it was about patience, not the passive kind, not the kind that sits and waits for things to improve on their own, but the active kind. The kind that requires you to keep showing up even when there's no evidence yet that the showing up is doing anything. The kind that looks, from the outside, a lot like stubbornness or foolishness or both. She would have said it was about the difference between what something looks like and what it is. That a frightened thing and a dangerous thing can look identical, and that the entire question of how you treat it depends on which one you're actually dealing with. She would have said it was about not becoming what was done to you, about carrying the damage without letting the damage become your definition. She'd seen it in a horse that the whole territory had written off as irredeemable, and she'd seen it in a foreman who'd been afraid and had acted badly from that fear and had then decided to try to be something else. And she'd seen it, if she was honest, in herself. The widow from Ohio, who everyone had laughed at, who could have packed that laughter away and carried it forever as a reason to be small, and who had not. And she would have said, because she was an honest woman, that none of it had been as clean as stories make it sound, that she had been afraid and uncertain and wrong about things, that she had made Rhett carry more than was fair by keeping her own counsel too long, that the patience she was so good at with horses was harder with people, and she was still working on it, that the mornings with Nightfall, those cold pre-dawn hours at the corral fence, talking to a horse about Ohio winters and dead husbands, and the particular arithmetic of starting over, had been as much for her as for him, if she was honest, which she was. On a September morning, 3 years after she'd stepped off a stagecoach in Frost Creek and heard the laughter, Brinley Hartwell Calloway sat at the kitchen table of the Box C before dawn and drank her coffee and listened to Montana wake up. Ada was in her room, asleep. She had stayed for summer and then stayed on. The arrangement with Charlotte's sister renegotiated in letters that had required a certain amount of diplomatic delicacy, but had resolved themselves into something everyone, including Ada, seemed to have decided was right. Rhett was somewhere outside already, doing what he did in the early morning. In a little while, he would come in for coffee and stand at the window beside her and look at the hills, and they would not talk for a while, and that would be enough. And then the day would begin. She heard Nightfall from the corral, a low sound, the sound he made in the mornings that wasn't about anything except presence, except the fact of being here and being ready. She finished her coffee and stood. She put her coat on and went out into the September morning, into the cold, clean air that carried the first suggestion of autumn in it, and walked across the yard to the corral, and Nightfall came to the fence. She reached through the rails and scratched that spot between his nostrils, and he closed his eyes. The hills were going gold in the early light, the particular gold of Montana in September that is different from any other gold, more final, more committed, the light of a place that knows what's coming and has made its peace with it. She stood there for a while. Rhett came out of the barn and stood at the other end of the fence, coffee in hand, and watched the hills with her, and they did not say anything, because there was nothing that needed saying that wasn't already said by the fact of them standing there, on that ground, in that light, having made something from what they'd each arrived with. That is enough. That is, in the end, what there is. The ground under your feet, and the work of your hands, and the things you built with the people who stayed, and the morning coming up new over the hills, again and again and again.